Hello everyone, I am the Midnight Storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Emma was working late again. The kind of late that made downtown Seattle feel alien. Deserted sidewalks, flickering neon lights, casting shadows onto rain-slicked pavement, and the city's usual clamor subsiding into near total silence. At 24, she was a junior associate at a mid-sized law firm, and this marked her third consecutive week of 12-hour days, preparing for a case scheduled for trial next month. It was past 1 in the morning when she stepped out of the office building. The clacking of her heels against the wet concrete echoed as she hurried toward the street corner where she usually caught a cab home. Her apartment was only a 15-minute drive away in a quiet neighborhood near Green Lake. But walking alone at this hour was out of the question, especially with the persistent drizzle that had started an hour ago and showed no signs of stopping. She stood at the curb, phone in hand, debating whether to use a ride-hailing app or wait for a passing taxi, when she spotted headlights cutting through the mist at the far end of the block. It was a yellow cab with its roof light on, signaling it was available. Emma raised her hand to hail it. The taxi slowed and pulled up right beside her. Its aging engine idled with a low, uneven rattle. The driver's side window rolled halfway down, revealing a middle-aged man with a weathered face, wearing a plaid shirt and eyes that looked far too weary for someone voluntarily working the night shift. He leaned slightly toward the open window and asked in an even, unhurried tone, "Where are the three of you headed?" Emma froze, her hands still hovering in the air from having hailed the cab. She quickly glanced left and right. The sidewalk was deserted. There was no one standing beside her, nor anyone loitering nearby waiting for a taxi. She was all alone under the dim streetlights, amidst a light, misty rain. A cold, unsettling shiver ran down her spine. In the brief moment it took to process the question, she told herself he must have mistaken her for a group. Perhaps he had been distracted by his phone, looked up too quickly, and miscounted the shapes and shadows in the rain. People made mistakes like that all the time, especially exhausted taxi drivers working the graveyard shift, running on caffeine and sheer willpower. Yet, a deep, primal instinct warned her not to correct him. Not to mention that she was alone. Instead, without fully understanding why, she yanked open the back door and quickly slid inside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Green Lake," she said, her voice higher and shakier than she intended. "Please, can we go right now? I'll pay double. I really need to get home." The driver studied her for a moment in the rearview mirror with an unreadable expression, then shrugged and shifted gears. "Suit yourself." The taxi pulled away from the curb, tires hissing softly against the wet asphalt, leaving the empty sidewalk behind. Emma sat rigid in the back seat, hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind replaying the driver's question. Where are the three of you going? There was no one else there. She was absolutely certain of that. Yet, the way he asked, so casually, so naturally, as if merely confirming an obvious number of passengers, made the hair on her arm stand on end. She couldn't help but glance at the empty spaces on either side, harboring an irrational hope that she might see something invisible from outside the vehicle. There was nothing, just empty vinyl seats, slightly damp from the air and faintly smelling of stale cigarette smoke clinging to the upholstery, and the reflection of her own face, pale, with wide staring eyes, looking back at her from the darkened window. City lights streaked past the window in flashes of amber and white as the taxi accelerated, gliding along the deserted streets. Emma kept her eyes fixed on the receding buildings, trying to steady her breathing and convince herself that perhaps she had misheard, or that he was speaking via a hands-free device, or any of a dozen mundane explanations. Reasons that, the more she considered them, seemed as flimsy as tissue paper. Gradually, block by block, her heart rate began to settle. The steady hum of the engine and the familiar landmarks slipping by, the all-night pharmacy, the closed cafe she passed every morning, helped restore her sense of normalcy. By the time the car turned onto the main road leading to Green Lake, she had almost convinced herself she had overreacted. That fatigue and the stress of the case were making her overly sensitive to nothing at all. She even let out a soft, embarrassed laugh. the self-deprecating kind that follows a moment of groundless fear. She checked the time on her phone and realized they were only about 7 minutes away from her apartment. Just then, the driver spoke again. "So, where is she going now?" Emma's head snapped up from her phone screen. In the rearview mirror, the driver's gaze was no longer on the road ahead. His eyes were fixed on the empty seat beside her, studying it with a casual attentiveness, just as he might observe any ordinary passenger. "What?" Emma breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "That other person," the driver said, his voice still calm and indifferent, as if asking the most ordinary question in the world. She suddenly went quiet. "She said she was going to Green Lake. Was she heading there too, or did she need to go somewhere else?" Emma went cold all over. She slowly turned her head, forcing herself to look at the seat beside her, half certain, half terrified that this time she would actually see something. But there was nothing there. Just an empty vinyl seat with the glow of streetlights skimming across its slightly damp surface. "There's no one else here," Emma said, her voice trembling now, unable to hide the fear seeping into her words. "It's just me. It's always been just me." The driver's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, locking directly onto hers for the first time since she'd gotten in. His expression shifted. Not quite confusion, but a look of serious recalculation, like a man revising a story he had long told himself. "Right," he said slowly, drawing out the last syllable. "Just you." But his tone didn't sound convinced. Worse still, he didn't look away from the mirror. His gaze lingered on the empty space beside her, a beat too long before finally returning to the road ahead. A heavy, stifling silence settled over the car. Emma pressed herself against the door, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and that empty seat. Her mind raced with theories, yet none of them felt truly plausible. Was the driver sleep-deprived and seeing things? A cruel prank? Or some kind of test? Nothing could explain the certainty in his voice both times he asked, nor could anything explain why, even though reason told her the seat beside her was completely empty. She couldn't shake a growing, chilling sensation. The temperature in the car seemed to have dropped a few degrees since they left the city center, and the faint scent of stale tobacco was now being overpowered by something else. Something colder, damper, like the smell of wet earth after the rain. The lights of her apartment building gradually came into view ahead, warm and golden against the misty night. Never in her life had Emma felt such relief at the sight of her own building. "Stop here, please," she said hurriedly, her hand already reaching for her purse. "This is fine, right here." But the driver didn't slow down. On the contrary, the car seemed to speed up, gliding right past her building without so much as a turn signal. "Hey," Emma said, her voice sharpening with panic. "I said stop here. This is my building." The driver's eyes met hers again in the rearview mirror, and this time his expression was devoid of any indifference. "That's not what she told me," he said softly. "She said you needed to go somewhere else first." Emma's hand froze on the door handle. "What are you talking about? There is no her here. I already told you where I was going. Stop the car right now." The driver didn't answer. His foot remained pressed on the gas pedal. The taxi sped past the second intersection, then the third, taking her further and further away from her building with every passing second. Streetlights blurred past at an unnatural speed, and tires hissed against the wet pavement. Emma yanked at the door handle, her fingers slipping on the cold sweat born of panic. The door wouldn't budge. She realized with horror that the child lock was engaged, a safety feature that had suddenly transformed from a safeguard into a trap. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the window. "Stop the car, right now." "She's getting angry," the driver muttered, as if speaking to himself, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Emma realized with a jolt that he wasn't talking to her at all. He was speaking to the empty seat beside her, as though conducting some secret negotiation she knew nothing about. "There is no her," Emma shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "It's just me. It's always been just me." The driver's hands tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. For the first time, a look of genuine fear flickered across his weathered face. Not fear of Emma, but fear of something else entirely, something he could see but she couldn't. She kept directing me all night long, he said, his voice trembling now, even before she got in the car. She flagged me down 2 blocks away from where I picked her up, pointed out exactly where her friend was standing, told me to turn the car around. Emma's blood ran cold. That's impossible, she whispered. I was alone. I was the only one standing on that street corner. She said, the driver's voice cracked, his composure finally shattering. She said her friend didn't know yet, that I wasn't to tell that friend, that I was just to keep driving until she told me where to stop. The car swerved slightly as the driver's hands shook on the wheel. Emma hurriedly gripped the door frame to steady herself, her mind reeling as she tried to find some logic in a night where everything had turned irrational the moment she stepped into this car. Where is she taking us? Emma asked, her voice nearly drowned out by the pounding of her heart. The driver's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror one last time. And what she saw there wasn't malice. It was sheer, naked, unconcealed terror. Riverside, he said. She kept talking about Riverside, the old access road by the sewage treatment plant. Emma knew that road. Everyone in the city did. In that vague, uneasy way, people know about places with dark histories. A desolate stretch by the river where a hit-and-run had occurred 3 years ago. A young woman had been stabbed to death while walking home from a night shift, and her body was discovered by a maintenance worker the following morning. The case had dominated local headlines for weeks. The killer was never found. Turn the car around, Emma said, trying to keep her voice calm, even though every instinct in her was screaming to do the opposite. Turn around right now and take me to my apartment. I don't care what she's saying to you. You're the one driving this car. For a long, tense moment, the driver remained silent, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, torn between conflicting orders from 2 entirely different sources, one real, one virtual. Then, with a violent jerk of the steering wheel, he made a sharp U-turn. The tires screeched piercingly against the wet pavement, throwing Emma hard against the car door. I'm not doing this anymore, the driver said, his voice trembling yet resolute. I don't care what she wants. I'm taking you home. The taxi sped back along the route they had just traveled. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and his eyes darted constantly to the rearview mirror, anxious and wary, as if anticipating something to suddenly appear. Yet the empty seat beside Emma remained still and silent, and the temperature inside the car gradually returned to normal. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the journey. Emma sat pressed against the car door, watching familiar streets come into view. The warm yellow lights of her building appeared. A sight like a scene from a dream she was desperate to escape. This time, when the car pulled up to the curb, the driver didn't just speed past. We're here, he said softly, his voice hoarse and heavy with exhaustion. This really is your home, isn't it? Yes, Emma whispered, her hand fumbling for the door handle. She let out a sigh of relief when she found it unlocked. Thank you. Please, just let me out. The child's safety lock disengaged with a faint click. Emma hurried out onto the sidewalk so quickly she nearly stumbled, her legs trembling. The cool night air washed over her face, feeling vivid and real after the suffocating tension inside the car. She turned back. An instinct compelled her to look at the driver one last time. He sat motionless behind the wheel, staring straight ahead through the windshield, his face pale and gaunt in the glow from the dashboard. Are you okay? Emma asked, even though every rational impulse told her to simply run inside and lock the door tight. The driver didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. She isn't in the car anymore, he said. She got out somewhere on 5th Avenue. I don't know when. I didn't even feel her leave. Emma's stomach tightened. Who was she? The driver slowly shook his head, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the distance beyond the windshield. I don't know. I've driven this route for 11 years. Sometimes people hail me who aren't really there. It's happened before. But never like this. Never for this long. Finally, he looked at her, and his expression, weary, haunted, and utterly sincere, told her he wasn't lying or playing some elaborate prank. Go inside, he said, Lock the door. I mean it." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She hurried up the building's steps, fumbling to fit her key into the lock, and didn't look back until she was safe in the lobby, hearing the heavy glass door click shut behind her. Through the rain-streaked glass, she watched the taxi slowly pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner, vanishing into the misty night. She couldn't sleep a wink that night. She sat in her apartment with all the lights on, turning the driver's words over and over in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of the empty seat beside her, nor could she stop wondering who, or what, had ridden there the whole way, silently guiding a stranger's car to the very spot where a young woman had died alone, unseen and unheard, until it was far too late. Weeks later, while searching for information, driven, she told herself, by a somewhat morbid curiosity, Emma stumbled upon an old article about the victim of a hit-and-run accident from 3 years prior. Accompanying the piece was a grainy photo of a young woman in her 20s with dark hair and a warm smile. Friends described her as someone who always cared for others. The article mentioned, almost as a side note, that the victim was last seen leaving a downtown office building late at night, trying to hail a taxi home in the rain. From that day on, Emma relied exclusively on ride-hailing apps. She never hailed a taxi on the street again, not even once, no matter how late she worked or how deserted the sidewalk seemed. Yet sometimes, while waiting for her ride and standing alone under the streetlights with mist swirling around her ankles, she would find herself glancing instinctively to the side, just to be certain that no one was actually standing there with her. Where are you listening to this story? In your room or in a taxi? Don't worry, I'm here with you. Let's move on to the next story of the evening. Have you ever wondered how many people it takes to run a lighthouse? The official answer is 1. But after that winter, I was no longer sure that figure was correct. My name is Thomas Reed. I took the job of tending the Grayfin Lighthouse when I was 40 years old. The lighthouse sits on a small, windswept island off the coast of Maine, about 11 miles from the nearest fishing village. It was no longer a job many people wanted. Automated systems had replaced keepers at most lighthouses decades ago. But Grayfin's aging equipment still required manual oversight during the harsh winter months. The Coast Guard paid handsomely for anyone willing to spend 6 months living in near total isolation there. I took the job for reasons that seemed complex at the time, yet, looking back, were painfully simple. My marriage had fallen apart that spring. My daughter, then 17 and furious with both her parents, had stopped returning my calls. The idea of total isolation, of a job with clear mechanical responsibilities and no human entanglements, appealed to a part of me I had never truly explored. The island itself was less than half a mile across, a rocky outcrop with the lighthouse at its highest point, a small keeper's cottage at the base of the tower, and nothing else but patches of scrubby grass and the endless gray ocean stretching out in every direction. Every 3 weeks, weather permitting, a supply ship would call, bringing food, fuel, and occasionally letters that, for the most part, I couldn't be bothered to answer. I adapted to life here far more quickly than I had expected. Mornings were for checking equipment, afternoons for maintenance and logbook entries, evenings for watching the beam of light sweep in a steady arc across the dark water. A rhythm soaked, it almost induced a meditative calm. The lighthouse now ran on an automatic timer, switching on at dusk and off at dawn, though I still climbed the tower's spiral staircase twice a day to inspect the mechanism, the bulb, and the rotating lens. Habits left over from the days of manual operation before automation took over. It was the second week of December when I began to notice something amiss. I woke around 3:00 a.m. To a faint humming vibration traveling through the walls of the house, the sound of the lighthouse's rotating motor kicking in. I lay there in the dark, bewildered, mentally reviewing the timer's schedule. By rights, the light should only activate at twilight. Yet here it was, running for hours on end, sweeping its beam across the pitch-black water, where no ship needed guidance at this hour, long after the shipping season had ended. I threw on a coat, pulled on my boots, and climbed the tower stairs, reassuring myself that it was likely just a technical glitch, the sort of thing that happened occasionally with such antiquated equipment, especially given how the salt air constantly seeped into every electronic component on the island. I stepped into the lantern room and found everything perfectly normal. The light rotated steadily, the mechanism ran smoothly, and every component functioned perfectly, save for one simple yet baffling fact. It wasn't supposed to be operating at that moment. I checked the timer panel twice, found no errors in the settings, then reset it manually and went back to bed, telling myself it was just a random glitch, perhaps caused by a power surge from the storm that had swept across the island 2 days earlier. But 3 nights later, it happened again. At the exact same time, almost to the minute. At 3:07 a.m., the rotation motor began to hum in the quiet of the night, and the beam of light swept once more across the water, where nothing was waiting to be guided home. After that second incident, I began keeping more meticulous records, noting the time, weather conditions, and anything else that might explain the pattern. I told myself this was simply good work practice, a standard troubleshooting procedure, nothing more. A keeper's duty is to know his equipment inside out. If a device malfunctions in the exact same way twice at the same time of day, it warrants careful documentation rather than being dismissed as superstition. The timer malfunctioned 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, always between 3:00 and 3:30 a.m., and each episode lasted no more than 20 minutes before shutting off on its own. I reported the issue to the mainland station during a routine radio check. The technician on duty, a guy named Garrett, who sounded bored and clearly wanted to get back to whatever he'd been doing, suggested the cause might be a corroded relay, a common problem with aging coastal equipment. He told me to keep monitoring it until the next supply run, at which point they'd send a professional electrician out to take a look. I accepted that explanation because it was simple, and because it fit perfectly with the practical, mechanical world I had chosen to inhabit on this island. Salt air corrodes everything. Old equipment breaks down. There was nothing strange about it. Then, I started finding footprints. I remember it was a Tuesday morning, because I made a habit of crossing off each passing day on the small calendar hanging above the kitchen table. One of the few remaining routines that helped me maintain a sense of the normal flow of time. I climbed the tower for my usual morning inspection and discovered a trail of damp footprints on the lantern room's metal floor. They led from the top of the spiral staircase straight to the control panel, then back again. Bare footprints. They were the size of an adult's, but narrow, with an odd shape I couldn't quite I stood there for a long time, staring thoughtfully at the prints while theories raced through my mind. Could it be condensation? The lantern room often grew damp at night. Moisture would collect on the cold metal surfaces and drip down, forming strange shapes. But condensation doesn't leave footprints. Footprints require weight, contact, and an actual foot pressing against the floor. I checked the door leading to the outer gallery, the narrow walkway encircling the lantern room. It was still locked tight, exactly as I had left it the night before. The old iron latch was rusted stiff from disuse. There was only one staircase leading up the tower. I had climbed it myself less than 20 minutes earlier. The path had been dry, undisturbed, and covered in the same fine layer of dust that usually settled overnight in that cold stone stairwell. Standing in the silent lantern room, listening to the wind howl against the glass, I told myself I must have simply overlooked the footprints on my way up. That they had been there all along. But I had been too distracted, too focused on the control panel to notice them when I entered. It was a flimsy explanation, and I knew it the moment the thought crossed my mind. But I wasn't ready to face another possibility. The prospect of remaining alone on a desolate rock in the open sea. 11 miles from the nearest settlement, barely 1/6 of the way through a 6-month contract, with no practical way to unilaterally quit and leave immediately. The footprints appeared again the next morning, and the morning after that. They always followed the same pattern. Wet, barefoot prints leading from the stairs to the control panel and back again. They were fresh every single day, despite the outer door being securely locked. And despite the layer of dust I deliberately left on the stairs each night, just to see if anything passed by. Nothing disturbed the dust. Yet every morning, those footprints awaited me in the lantern room, as if whatever made them had suddenly materialized right there on the tower floor without ever having to climb the stairs at all. By the end of January, I was no longer getting a full night's sleep. I found myself waking automatically around 2:45 a.m., Lying rigid in the darkness and listening to the low hum of the rotating motor, my body seemed to sense the coming disturbance before it actually arrived. Some nights it appeared, others it didn't. I could never predict it, and that very uncertainty became a different kind of exhaustion. A low-level, persistent dread that seeped into every hour of the day. I had requested an early supply run, hoping the visiting crew might spot something I'd missed or offer a rational explanation that my sleep-deprived, isolated mind couldn't fathom. But the weather didn't cooperate. A fierce winter storm swept in from the northeast, battering the coast for nearly 2 weeks and making any sea travel impossible. In effect, I was completely cut off. It was during that storm, on a night when the fog was so thick I couldn't see the water from my kitchen window, that things escalated far beyond anything I could attribute to corroded relays or condensation. Unable to sleep, I'd gone up to the lantern room around midnight for a spot check, hoping the familiar climb up the stairs might steady my nerves. The light was functioning normally, right on schedule. Its beams sliced through the fog, sweeping back and forth with a slow, steady rhythm. I stood there for a while, watching the light, letting the mechanical cadence soothe the unease churning in my chest. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Out on the external gallery, that narrow iron walkway encircling the lantern room, accessible only through a locked door I checked meticulously every night, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling the tower. The metal grating groaned softly under each step, just as it did beneath my own weight whenever I ventured out there. I froze at the control panel, every muscle in my body locking up. I told myself it was just the wind, a trick played by the fog and the howling gusts battering the metal mesh, or perhaps an auditory illusion of the sort this ancient structure was prone to producing. But the rhythm was too steady, too purposeful, too much like actual footsteps to be dismissed as mere wind. I forced myself toward the door to check the latch. It remained firmly locked, as solid and rusted shut as it was during every daily inspection, pressing my face against the frost-rimmed window pane. I peered out at the gallery. The fog swirled so thickly that I could barely see a meter in any direction. The footsteps continued, steadily circling and passing right in front of me, distinct and clear despite the howling wind, and despite the fact that I could see nothing through the clouded glass beyond the swirling white mist. I do not know how long I stood there, paralyzed, listening to something slowly and patiently, pacing around the sealed tower, 11 miles away from the nearest human warmth. I waited so long that my legs finally gave way. I slid down to sit against the wall of the lantern room, my back pressed against the cold stone, listening to those footsteps continue their steady, unhurried circuit, round and round, never speeding up or slowing down, and never once attempting to open the securely locked door. Just before dawn, the footsteps finally fell silent. The fog began to lift as the storm subsided, and the weak, gray light of a winter day filtered through the tower windows. I checked the gallery walkway once the sun was fully up. There were no footprints in the frost coating the metal grating, no sign whatsoever that anyone had been out there. I radioed the mainland station at the scheduled reporting time. My voice, I am certain, betrayed more than I intended to reveal. I asked, as calmly as I could, whether any fishing boats or Coast Guard vessels had logged a stop at Grafin Island over the past 2 weeks. Anyone who might have come ashore during the storm, someone I might have inadvertently missed due to the fog and exhaustion. The operator checked the harbor logs and replied a few minutes later. Her voice held the patient tone of someone humoring a question she found rather odd. No vessel had approached Grafin Island in over 3 weeks. The storm had kept all boats in port. As far as any official record could confirm, I was completely, utterly alone. I hadn't slept a wink during the final week of the storm. I spent each day in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on exhaustion, performing my duties with mechanical precision, while a primal instinct deep within my brain remained constantly on guard for footsteps that might sound at any moment, day or night, even though, in reality, they never appeared during the daylight hours. When the weather finally calmed and the supply boat made its delayed trip to the island, I nearly wept at the sight of it, cutting through the gray waters toward the dock. Garrett was on that boat, accompanied by an electrician named Paulson. He spent most of the day inspecting the wiring, the timing mechanism, and every detail of the equipment I had meticulously documented in my logbook. Paulson discovered a corroded relay in the timing system. A clear physical fault that fully explained the erratic automatic switching of the light I had noted back in December. He replaced the part, thoroughly tested the entire system, and the light never malfunctioned again for the remainder of that winter. Yet, he found nothing to explain those footprints. There was no accounting for the sound of footsteps pacing the corridor outside, a space kept securely locked in the dead of a foggy midnight when the nearest ship was fully 11 miles away. I told Garrett everything while we sat in the cottage kitchen as Paulson worked upstairs. He listened without a trace of the skepticism or scorn I had feared. When I finished speaking, he remained silent for a long time, gazing thoughtfully down at his coffee cup before finally speaking. "You aren't the first keeper to report." "Something like that here," he said cautiously. "There's a note in an old logbook from way back, from a keeper in the pre-automation days, in the 50s. It was the same sort of story. Footsteps in the hallway. No one ever figured out what they were. That man requested a transfer after 2 winters and never spoke of it again." He offered no further explanation, and I didn't ask. I came to realize that some things simply defy the ordinary rules of this world, and the only choice left is deciding how to live with that truth. I completed my first winter at Grafin Lighthouse, and then, defying what most would consider common sense, I signed on for 2 more. I told myself it was for the money, because there was nowhere else I really wanted to be, and because of the strange quiet the island offered during those long stretches when nothing unusual happened. All of that was partly true, but a smaller, truer part of me stayed simply because I needed to know I could face it, that I could hold my ground regardless of what the place might reveal to me, rather than running away from something I couldn't yet name. The footsteps returned during the second winter and the third. They always came in the dead of night, amidst the swirling fog, pacing slowly and patiently around that room with the locked hallway. I never opened that door after midnight again, no matter how desperate I was for answers, or how many nights I sat frozen, my back against the cold stone wall, listening to something pacing steadily around me in the dark. Yet after that first harrowing winter, I changed one habit. I never went up to the lantern room alone after midnight again. Not because there was anyone else on the island to accompany me, but because I began to speak aloud as I climbed those stairs each night. I would introduce myself and narrate my routine checks into the void of the stairwell, much like soothing a frightened animal, or sometimes, in my darkest moments, like conversing with someone who, after decades of solitude in the tower, simply wanted to know they hadn't been entirely forgotten. Those footsteps never tried the door. They never spoke, never left a trace, save for those wet prints that briefly appeared and vanished that December. They simply paced, night after night amidst the fog, keeping watch alongside me in our shared solitude. Even now, years after leaving that island, I sometimes wonder, in the dead of night, whether the Grafin Lighthouse truly required only one keeper, or if, for longer than any official record could account for, the place had always needed 2. Do you know how much a lighthouse keeper earns? Let me know in the comments section, and if it were you, would you want to do that job all alone? Be honest. Now, let's move on to the next story of the evening. Are you ready? The sound of train wheels rolling along the tracks at night has a rhythm all its own, slow and steady, like a lullaby. I've taken the night train countless times in my life, but only one journey changed the way I looked at an empty seat. My name is Claire Whitfield. That November, I was 31 years old and taking the night train from Edinburgh, traveling through the English countryside to visit my parents in a small village near York. It wasn't a trip I made often. Work kept me in the city most weekends. But that year, my mother's birthday fell on a Tuesday, and the night train seemed the most sensible option to arrive in time without wasting a full day of leave. When I boarded at 9:30 p.m., the carriage was nearly deserted. The platform lights cast long, amber gold streaks across the damp concrete. November in Scotland meant early darkness, persistent drizzle, and bone-chilling cold, making the warm, dimly lit carriage feel incredibly inviting, even with so few passengers. I chose a window seat in the second carriage, stowed my bag in the overhead rack, and settled in for a 7-hour journey that I assumed would be entirely unremarkable. For the first hour or so, things went exactly as expected. I watched the last few scattered city lights give way to the dark countryside, read a few chapters of the paperback I'd brought along, and began to drift off as the train settled into its steady, rhythmic motion. Apart from the ticket inspector, who passed by shortly after departure, and the faint murmur of 1 or 2 passengers at the far end of the carriage, I had the space almost entirely to myself. The train made its first stop around 11 p.m. at a small rural station, its name a blur as we passed, illuminated by a single flickering platform light. I glanced up absently from my book as the train slowed, watching a few figures move across the platform outside, and that was when I noticed him. A man was sitting in the seat directly across the aisle, facing me. I was middle-aged and unremarkable in appearance, wearing a gray jacket, with dark hair thinning at the crown and his hands clasped neatly in his lap. I hadn't noticed him bored, nor had I heard him sit down during the hour we'd been traveling. Yet there he was, watching the platform with the indifferent, distracted air typical of any weary passenger. I thought nothing of it. Passengers often moved between carriages on night trains, especially when they were this empty. They might be looking for a quieter spot, more legroom, or simply a change of scenery. I returned to my book, barely registering his presence, and gave it no further thought until the train pulled into the next station about 40 minutes later. He was still there. Same seat, same posture, hands still neatly in his lap. Only now, he seemed to be looking straight at me instead of out the window. A prickle of unease ran down the back of my neck, but I quickly brushed it aside. It was just a coincidence. Perhaps he simply liked that seat, and there was no reason preventing him from sitting there for the entire journey if he wished. It wasn't until the third stop, nearly an hour later, that a sense of unease became pronounced and impossible to simply brush aside. For at that third stop, I suddenly recalled something that gave me a start. I had seen this man earlier that evening, sitting 4 carriages away, near the rear of the train, when I was walking through the cars looking for the dining carriage shortly after we left Edinburgh. The train pulled into a medium-sized interchange station where it was scheduled for a longer stop. Nearly 40 minutes, according to the timetable I'd checked before boarding, to wait for a connecting train and a crew change. Most of the few passengers I had noticed earlier had disembarked to stretch their legs on the platform. A few wandered into the small station building for a coffee or a cigarette. I gazed out at the platform, thoughts stirring about getting off the train. All the other passengers near us had stepped off during that interminable stop. I had watched them walk away, seen the platform empty of the crowd that had gathered around the coffee stand. But the man in the gray coat remained motionless, hands clasped, his gaze fixed on a spot just behind my shoulder. He seemed completely unbothered by the 40-minute wait, the cold night air drifting in through the open doors at either end of the carriage, or anything else. That was when a cold, stealing a glance at the seat across the aisle every few minutes, half hoping to see it empty, yet half dreading that it wouldn't be. He remained motionless. Past the 4th stop and then the 5th, he stayed put with that same quiet, composed, and unhurried air. His gaze wandered aimlessly between the window and, at times, in a way that unsettled me, in my direction. Around 1 a.m, creeping realization took hold of my chest. This wasn't a case of a passenger changing seats out of restlessness or personal preference. This was an entity that had been sitting right across from me, in one form or another, since before we even left Edinburgh. At times appearing in this carriage, then in another 4 cars away. The figure finally settled into the seat opposite me and never left again, ignoring the train stops at station after station, while other passengers came and went. I thought about moving to a different carriage. I seriously considered it. My hand even tightened around the strap of the bag resting on the overhead rack. Yet something, perhaps pride, or a stubborn refusal to let a vague feeling dictate my actions, or simply exhaustion after nearly 18 hours without sleep, kept me anchored to my seat as the train finally lurched into motion, leaving the interchange station to plunge into the rural darkness. We had a long stretch ahead for the next stop, nearly 50 minutes traversing open fields, followed by a long tunnel cutting through low hills or so I recalled from the route map on previous journeys. For the remainder of the trip, I did not take my eyes off the seat opposite me. Not even once. Sitting in the dim light of the carriage, I told myself I must have been mistaken. 4 carriages away is a fair distance, and I had only caught a fleeting glimpse of him as I passed. At the time, I was distracted by the flashing closed sign on the buffet and a touch of annoyance at having failed to get a cup of tea. People can look remarkably alike, especially in poor light. Or when one is tired and one's mind is more occupied with the book in hand than with the strangers around. But the more closely I observed him now, something I couldn't stop myself from doing, the more certain I became. The same gray coat, the same thinning dark hair, the same strangely still posture, hands clasped in his lap, as if he had been sitting exactly like that for hours rather than just a few minutes. I tried to force myself to look away, down at my book, but found I couldn't focus on a single word. My gaze kept drifting upward. The train picked up speed, leaving behind the last few scattered lights of the interchange station. The scenery outside blurred and dissolved into an absolute, formless blackness. I kept my eyes fixed on the man sitting across the aisle, silently hoping that my direct, unblinking stare might somehow force him to shift, that he would stir in his seat, check his phone, or do anything an ordinary, weary passenger might do on a long overnight journey. He did nothing. He simply sat there, hands clasped, his distant gaze fixed on the space behind me, as still and composed as he had been when he first boarded at the initial stop. I felt the train's rhythm shift slightly, a subtle change in air pressure in my ears, that distinctive hollow resonance of a night train entering a tunnel. And I caught a glimpse out the window, just as the last strip of open sky vanished, swallowed by solid rock walls as the train plunged into the long tunnel cutting through the hills. The carriage lights flickered once, the sort of momentary blink common to aging train lighting systems when passing through tunnels with unstable power supplies. Instinctively, I glanced back at the man opposite me. A part of me needed to keep him in sight, even in that dim light. Then, the lights went out completely. This wasn't just a flicker. It was an absolute, enveloping darkness that swallowed every point of reference. It was made all the more terrifying by the ominous roar echoing off the tunnel walls, pressing in on either side of the train, and the screeching of iron wheels against the tracks, a sound that became jarring and ear-splitting in the absence of any visual anchor. I have no idea how long that darkness lasted. It felt like minutes had passed, though in hindsight, I realize it was likely only 20 or 30 seconds. The sort of brief interruption common when the power system glitches while a train is in a tunnel. Yet, sitting there in that pitch-black void, unable to see the seat across from me, unable to tell if the man was still in his place or had decided to move after hours of absolute stillness, I experienced a fear unlike anything I had ever known. Something lightly brushed against my knee in the dark. The sensation was feather-light and fleeting, vanishing before I could even fully register it. Yet its presence was undeniable. A soft touch on my leg, right where someone passing from the opposite seat would make contact. I couldn't utter a sound. My throat tightened, and my entire body froze with a primal terror. A silence so profound that even breathing felt like a dangerous risk. Then, just as abruptly as they had vanished, the lights flared back on. The train burst from the tunnel mouth into the open night. A pale shaft of moonlight flooded through the window, blindingly bright after the pitch-black darkness I had been immersed in. The seat opposite me was empty. It wasn't just unoccupied. It held an unsettling emptiness that made my breath catch in my chest as I stared, unable to look away. A faint indentation still lingered on the cushion, as if someone had been sitting there for hours. And when I tremblingly reached across the narrow aisle, pressing my palm firmly against the worn fabric, I felt it instantly. Warmth. A genuine, palpable body heat radiating from a seat that, as far as I could tell, had been empty for less than a minute. That interval was far too brief for the residual warmth to be explained by anything ordinary or logical within the laws of this world. A world where seats only grow warm when an actual human body sits upon them. I jerked my hand back so quickly I nearly tumbled from my own seat. I sat frozen for the rest of the journey, staring fixedly at that empty, yet still warm seat, until the train began to slow for the next stop. Only then did I force my trembling legs to carry me down the aisle toward the front of the carriage, heading for the small compartment where the ticket inspector was stationed. A detail I knew from an earlier announcement. The ticket inspector was a large man in his 50s, sitting in the small staff compartment near the front of the carriage with a thermos of coffee and a paperback book. He looked up in mild surprise when I appeared at the doorway just before 2 in the morning, pale-faced and visibly trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked, setting his book aside. I don't recall exactly how I explained it to him. The words came out in a rush, barely coherent. It was something about a man who had sat opposite me all night. Someone who had been there even before the train left Edinburgh, never leaving his seat despite the train's long stops, only to vanish suddenly as we passed through a tunnel, leaving behind a seat that I insisted was still warm. To his credit, the inspector didn't dismiss what I said. He listened intently, his expression shifting from polite concern to a more cautious, thoughtful look. When I finished, he asked me to show him the exact seat I was talking about. We walked back to my carriage together. The seat looked just as it had when I left, empty and ordinary. The upholstery was no longer warm by the time we arrived, though as I stood there with the inspector, I could have sworn the faint indentation in the cushion hadn't quite sprung back to its original shape. "I need to check something," he said, his tone carefully neutral, the kind of voice people use when trying not to alarm someone further. "We have a security camera system covering every carriage. Please give me a few minutes." He returned after about 10 minutes. His expression changed. The initial polite professional concern now replaced by an unnameable look, bordering on genuine unease. "I've reviewed the footage," he said slowly. "From this carriage, for the entire journey since leaving Edinburgh." He paused, glanced at the empty seat, then looked back at me. "No one sat in that seat, miss. Not a soul the whole trip. You were the only one sitting on this side of the aisle. That seat was completely empty the entire way." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's impossible. I saw him. I saw him board the train. I saw him sitting there for hours." The ticket inspector didn't argue with me, nor did he try to offer rational explanations like camera angles or technical glitches. He simply stared silently at the empty seat for a long moment with an inscrutable expression, then finally said quietly, "This isn't the first time I've heard a story like this on this route. Not by a long shot." He offered to move me to another carriage for the rest of the journey, one closer to the staff cabin, and I agreed immediately, without hesitation, my hands still trembling as I gathered my things. A few hours later, I arrived at the village where my parents lived. I got there just as dawn was breaking, looking haggard and exhausted. When my mother met me at the small local station, I didn't tell her the real reason I looked so shaken. Instead, I simply made excuses about a poor night's sleep and the exhaustion of overnight travel. I still take night trains, even more frequently than necessary, considering what happened. There is something about the steady rhythm of wheels on the tracks in the dead of night that I've never been able to shake. A stubborn part of me refuses to let a single journey alter how I feel about all future trips. Yet, I have permanently changed one habit. I no longer choose a window seat in quiet, empty carriages, no matter how appealing that spaciousness might be. Now, I always seek out the carriage closest to the staff cabin, ensuring a crew member is nearby, regardless of the hour or the length of the journey ahead. And since that night, I have never once glanced at the empty seat across the aisle without wondering, if only for a fleeting moment, whether it was truly as empty as it appeared. Have you ever traveled by train? Was there anyone sitting next to you on your most recent trip? Do let me know. Perhaps next time I'll be the one sitting beside you, and together we can listen to the next story. This isn't a ghost story. At least I don't think it is. It's the story of a bookshop I could only find on the nights I needed it most, and could never locate again once daylight broke. My name is Daniel Foster. When all this happened, I was 22 and in my final year at university in Bristol, England. That autumn, I was suffering from severe insomnia, the kind brought on by too much stress, too much caffeine, and a looming thesis deadline that kept my mind racing late into the night. I lived in a small rented flat above a laundromat in a quiet neighborhood. Whenever I couldn't sleep, my habit was to go for a walk. I would wander aimlessly through the deserted streets until exhaustion finally overcame my restless mind. Every night, I followed a familiar route. Past the corner shop, along the row of terraced houses, past the old ivy-covered church, and then back home via a narrow alley lined with shuttered storefronts, most closed just for the night, though a few were permanently abandoned, with faded, warped to-let signs stuck to their windows. It was during one of these walks, shortly after 1 o'clock on a cold Tuesday morning in late October, that I noticed something that hadn't been there before. It was a bookshop. Its front window cast a warm, golden glow into the dark street. An old-fashioned bell hung above the wooden door, which stood slightly ajar despite the late hour. I had walked past this street dozens of times over the past month, and I was certain, 100% certain, that the space had always been vacant, the windows dark, the old peeling sign advertising a long-defunct business that I had never bothered to read closely. Curiosity, or perhaps just the peculiar, unsteady logic that arises from severe sleep deprivation, compelled me to walk toward the door. Inside, the bookstore was small, yet surprisingly cozy. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, packed with books of every size and era. The air was filled with the distinctive scent of old paper and leather bindings, a fragrance any true book lover would adore. A soft, golden glow emanated from a few scattered reading lamps, and somewhere in the back, I heard the faint, soothing creak of old wooden floorboards. An elderly man emerged from the gap between two towering bookshelves before I had even fully stepped inside. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he wore a button-up cardigan that looked decades out of style, yet possessed a strange, captivating charm. He smiled at me with a warmth, ease, and composure that made it seem as though he had known I was coming all along. "Ah," he said before I could utter a word. "You must be looking for the Marquez book, aren't you? 100 Years of Solitude. Third shelf from the left, right in the middle." I stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, utterly astonished. In fact, I had been meaning to buy that very book for weeks. My thesis advisor had suggested it during a conversation nearly a month prior, a passing remark I had barely mentioned to anyone, and certainly never to a bookseller I had never met before in my life. "How did you know?" I started to ask. But the old man had already turned his back toward the shelves, humming a soft, aimless tune, and leaving my unfinished question hanging in the warm, book-scented air. I found the novel exactly where he had pointed. A worn hardcover with a slightly faded green dust jacket. I bought it without giving a second thought to the strangeness of the moment. Paying cash at a price so reasonable, I didn't even take note of it, and then walked home in a daze. The insomnia that had plagued me for weeks finally released its grip, allowing me to drift into a sound sleep that lasted until nearly noon the next day. That afternoon, I stood for a long time outside that dark, dust-covered shop. The two books I had bought, the Marquez novel and the collection of Japanese short stories, both of which still sat on the table in my apartment, suddenly felt far heavier in my memory than they had when I actually held them in my hands. That same week, I consulted local government records, searching for any publicly available information on the property that I could access through the university library's research database. The old woman had been right. The commercial space had officially been vacant for over a decade. The last recorded tenant was a small, independent bookstore that had closed down and never reopened, with the business ceasing operations shortly thereafter. The shop owner, according to a brief newspaper clipping from that era that I unearthed, was an elderly man who had run the store alone for decades before retiring, or perhaps, as the article's cautious, suggestive phrasing implied, and far more definitive than retirement. I found no name attached to that old article, nor any name I could say with certainty belonged to the man I had spoken with during my 3 midnight visits. In the days that followed, I told myself I ought to have been more frightened by all of this, that discovering an impossible bookstore operating inside a space that had been vacant and derelict for a decade should have sent me running, should have caused me sleepless nights of a completely different nature than my chronic insomnia. Yet strangely and inexplicably, my insomnia simply vanished. I had no rational explanation for it, either. That year, I finished my thesis on time and slept soundly every night. Something that hadn't happened since I started university. And my mind found a sense of peace that had eluded me for months. I never saw that bookshop again, no matter how many nights I deliberately walked down that street, or how often, in moments of restlessness. I yearned deep down to catch sight of it once more. I still have both those books. The Marquez novel sits on my bookshelf now, slightly worn from being read over and over. My date of birth is still clearly visible in ink that has faded with the years on the very first page. A detail I never managed to explain satisfactorily to anyone who asked, not even my future wife. She simply raised an eyebrow and decided, wisely, I think, not to press the matter further. I have moved twice since that autumn in Bristol, first for work, then for family, and I no longer live near that narrow street lined with tightly shuttered shops. Yet sometimes, on sleepless nights when my mind is racing with anxieties too overwhelming to settle on their own, I find myself thinking back to that warm, golden light, that unhurried, serene smile, and the gentle voice explaining that the shop opened only for those who truly needed it. Sometimes I wonder if that place is still there, patiently waiting in some strange space between ordinary nights, ready to open its doors once more to someone making their way home. Someone too late, too exhausted, or too lost in troubled thoughts to realize they have turned onto a street where no shops should be open at all. And occasionally, on the worst nights, I find myself almost hoping that the place will open its doors to me again. Though I have never quite decided whether I should embrace that hope or be wary of the very thing I long for. In the days that followed, I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps I had mentioned the Marquez novel to a mutual acquaintance who knew the shop owner. Perhaps I had spoken of it while half asleep during a seminar and simply forgotten. Stranger things had certainly happened during that exhausting, caffeine-fueled semester. The human mind is adept at weaving plausible narratives to fill in the gaps of the unknown. And mine had been working overtime on this mystery, but the insomnia returned that very week, as it always did. And one night, unable to sleep, I found myself walking down that street again, hoping and fearing all at once that the shop would still be there. It was. There was that same warm, golden light spilling from the window, the door still ajar despite the late hour, as if it were simply waiting for my return. The old man greeted me with the same gentle, natural smile as before. This time, before I had even fully crossed the threshold, he held out a slim paperback, a collection of short stories by a Japanese author. I had once intended to read after a casual suggestion from a friend weeks earlier, a suggestion I had never actually acted upon or mentioned to anyone else. "This one has been waiting for you," he said simply, placing the book in my hands. I took the book, the rationalizations I had constructed earlier suddenly feeling very flimsy, and opened the cover almost instinctively, just as one does with any new book, flipping past the title page to the first chapter. Right at the top of the first page, in faded, vintage-style ink, with handwriting that looked decades old rather than recently penned, was a date, my birthday. It wasn't just the month and day, but the year as well. My exact date of birth, written in ink that had clearly sat on the page for a long time. The way the ink had faded and seeped into the aged paper over years, not merely days. I stood there, amidst the warm bookstore scented with paper and ink, my eyes fixed on my birthday written in a stranger's hand inside a book I had never seen before. And a cold, creeping unease began to rise, shattering the pleasant haze of fatigue and gratitude I had felt just moments earlier. "I need to double-check something," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears, and pulled the Marquez novel from my bag. It was the book I had carried with me almost every day since my first visit. A curious little talisman, the reason for which I couldn't even explain to myself. I opened to the first page. There it was, that same date, my birthday, written in faded vintage-style ink at the very top of the page, in the exact spot I hadn't even thought to check the first time. I looked up at the old man. He was still watching me with his characteristic warmth, patience, and calm, as if the growing unease within me were merely a foreseen part of the evening. "Why is my birthday written in these books?" I asked, my voice growing tense. "I never told you my birthday. I don't even know your name." The old man's smile remained unchanged, yet his eyes shifted, revealing something ancient, heavy with the weight of time and the countless visitors who had passed through, far transcending the impression given by his brisk, vigorous demeanor. "Every book here will eventually find the person it belongs to," he said, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. "Sometimes that process takes a long time. As for the dates inscribed on them, They are simply the bookstore's way of leaving a trace. It wasn't exactly an answer. Not a rational explanation based on the usual rules governing bookstores, ink, dates, or anything else within my otherwise logical worldview, even in my exhausted state. Yet his tone conveyed that this was the only answer I would get that night. And a deep, weary part of me accepted it, much like one accepts the peculiar logic of a dream from which one isn't ready to wake. I left that night with the second book. A sense of ease mingled uncomfortably with a stubborn, undeniable curiosity, one I couldn't bring myself to abandon, despite the unsettling atmosphere of the evening. I didn't sleep well after that second visit, though the reason was entirely different from ordinary insomnia. My mind kept circling back to those faded ink strokes, that nonsensical date, and the old man's gentle yet evasive answer. I told myself I would stay away from that street for a while, letting this strange chain of events settle into something I could eventually explain, or simply forget. I lasted only 4 days. By the 5th night, unable to hold back any longer, I found myself walking down that familiar path again, telling myself I just wanted to take a peek, just to confirm the shop was still there. Nothing more. It was past midnight when I turned onto that narrow street, and there it was. That same warm, golden light spilling onto the deserted sidewalk, the door propped open just as it had been before. This time, I stood outside for a long while before entering, observing the shop from the street. For the first time, I noticed that the sign above the doorway was completely blank, not faded or worn, but simply left empty by design. A rectangular slab of wood bearing not a single word, as if the maker had never truly finished the job, or had never intended to give the place a name in the first place. I stepped inside. The old man was waiting, as always, though this time he didn't immediately hand me a book. He simply watched me quietly with his characteristic warmth and patience, waiting for the words I had come to say. "What is the name of this shop?" I asked directly, my voice steadier than I had expected. "I've walked past this spot every night for a month now. There was never a shop here before, and your sign doesn't have a name on it, either." The old man pondered the question for a long moment. His expression was one of deep thought rather than evasion, as if he genuinely wanted to give a satisfactory answer, but didn't quite know how to phrase it. "It has no name," he finally said. "At least not one that would mean anything to you. This place opens only for those who truly need its presence. You needed sleep. You needed the right book at the right moment, so it was here." "That makes no sense at all," I said. Though even as the words left my lips, a part of me realized the futility of demanding logic from a shop that printed my date of birth in ink that looked decades old, inside brand new books. "Most important things don't make sense. At least, not at first," the old man replied with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Feel free to ask questions, I don't mind. But I'm afraid you won't be satisfied with the answers, even if you do find them." I left that night without buying anything, feeling far more unsettled than I had after my previous 2 visits. And as I walked home through the cold, deserted streets, I made a decision. I would return during the day, in the daylight, with people passing by, when the ordinary, verifiable rules of the world were back in their proper order. I would find out, once and for all, just what kind of place that shop really was. The next afternoon, I returned to that street. The sunlight could not dispel the strange, anxious unease weighing on my chest as I approached the spot where the bookstore had stood the night before. The storefront looked exactly as I remembered it from before that first midnight visit. Dark and empty, its windows coated in years of accumulated dust. A faded, peeling "For Rent" sign sat askew in the corner of the glass, advertising a commercial real estate agency whose phone number, which I later tried calling out of stubborn curiosity, had long since been disconnected. I knocked on the door of the apartment directly above, then at the shop next door, asking the residents and business owners if they knew anything about the vacant space, whether it had ever been open for business, if anyone had seen lights on there recently, or if they had noticed anything unusual about the place. Everyone I spoke to gave the same answer. The shop had been empty for a very long time, so long that no one could even remember what kind of business it used to be. An elderly woman living in the adjacent apartment told me, with the calm certainty of someone who had lived on the street for over 30 years, that the space had been vacant since a small independent bookstore closed down. She vaguely recalled it happening sometime in the mid-2000s, nearly a decade prior. She couldn't remember the specific reason or circumstances behind the closure, only that one day the shop simply ceased operations and never opened its doors again. I thought the tapping on the back door was just a branch hitting the glass, until I counted 3 distinct knocks, a pause, and then the exact same sequence repeating for half an hour. Have you ever actually listened to true silence? It doesn't sound peaceful. When you are entirely alone, miles away from the nearest town, silence has a weight to it. It presses against your eardrums. It makes you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, and the creaking of the floorboards under your feet. I was 20 years old, back at my childhood home for a brief summer break before my junior year of college. The house was a classic single-story farmhouse situated at the very end of a 2-mile dirt road in the dense, evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest. My parents had decided to take a well-deserved anniversary trip to Hawaii, leaving me to look after the property. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. After sharing a cramped, noisy dormitory with 3 other girls for 9 months, the absolute isolation of the farm felt like paradise. Our nearest neighbor was an old retired veteran named Mr. Henderson, and his property was nearly a kilometer away through a thick patch of woods. You couldn't even see his chimney from our roof. It was just me, the towering pine trees, and the quiet. But that quiet was about to break. The local radio station had been broadcasting severe weather warnings since Tuesday morning. A massive, unseasonal storm system was pushing in from the coast. The forecasters were predicting torrential, blinding rain, sustained winds of up to 60 miles per hour, and guaranteed power outages by 4:11 p.m. On Thursday, the sky above the tree line had bruised into a deep, sickly purple. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a matter of minutes, and the wind began to howl through the eaves of the old house. I stood in the kitchen, a mug of hot coffee in my hands, looking out the window toward the backyard. The cell reception out here was always notoriously bad. But as I glanced down at my phone resting on the counter, I saw the signal indicator drop from 1 bar to completely blank. No service. A small rational part of my brain felt a sudden pinch of anxiety. Being alone was one thing. Being entirely disconnected was another. But I pushed the feeling down. My dad had raised me to be practical. He had taught me how to operate the backup generator, where to find the heavy-duty flashlights, and how to stay warm if the furnace quit. I knew this house. I knew how to survive in it. Before the rain started coming down in sheets, I realized I needed more firewood for the living room stove. The temperature was dropping fast, and if the power grid failed, that cast iron stove would be my only source of heat. I threw on my heavy yellow raincoat, grabbed a canvas tote bag, and pushed open the back door. The wind nearly ripped the door out of my grip. I stepped onto the porch and looked out at the yard. The trees were thrashing violently, their massive branches bending under the force of the gale. I put my head down and jogged the 50 yards across the dead grass to the woodshed. The shed was a sturdy, windowless structure made of thick cedar planks. My dad always kept it secured with a heavy iron latch and a padlock to keep raccoons and stray animals from nesting in the dry timber. But as I reached the shed, I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy iron latch was flipped open. The padlock was hanging loosely from the bottom ring, completely unhooked. I stared at it, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face. I distinctly remembered locking it 2 days ago when I grabbed kindling. My dad was meticulous about locking the outbuildings. It was a strict rule on the farm. So why was it open? I reached out, my fingers numb from the cold, and pulled the wooden door open. The hinges shrieked in the wind. Inside, it was dark, illuminated only by the dim, gray light spilling in from outside. I stepped over the threshold, intending to quickly grab the logs and leave. But as soon as I entered the cramped space, a smell hit me. It wasn't the usual scent of dry cedar and sawdust. It smelled like wet wool cheap motor oil, and stale cigarette smoke. My stomach tightened. Neither of my parents smoked. No one had been out here. I glanced toward the back corner of the shed, where the neatly stacked cords of wood usually sat undisturbed. The stack was a mess. Logs were scattered across the dirt floor, as if someone had recently rearranged them to carve out a small, hollow space in the back corner. And resting on a chopping block right near the entrance was a damp, crushed cigarette butt. Someone had been in here recently. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest. I didn't bother grabbing the firewood. I backed out of the shed, slammed the door shut, and threw the heavy iron latch back into place, clicking the padlock shut with a trembling hand. I turned and sprinted back across the yard. The sky broke open right as my boots hit the wooden steps of the back porch. The rain came down in a deafening roar, instantly soaking my jeans. I threw myself inside the house, slammed the heavy oak doors shut, and instantly twisted the brass deadbolt into place. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I stood in the mudroom, peeling off my wet raincoat, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe a hunter got caught in the changing weather and ducked in for a smoke. Maybe a hiker strayed off the trail. It made sense. It had to make sense. I walked into the kitchen and checked my phone again. Still, absolutely no service. I picked up the landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall, praying to hear a dial tone. I pressed it to my ear. Dead air. The line was completely flat. I hung the receiver up slowly. Outside, the storm raged, battering the siding of the house with relentless fury. The living room lamps flickered violently, buzzing with a sharp electrical whine before completely dying out. The house plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. I stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, listening to the roar of the wind outside. And then, cutting through the chaotic noise of the storm, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the kitchen window right behind me. Tap, tap, tap. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A branch hits a window randomly, driven by the chaos of the wind. This was the sound of a human hand, tapping on the glass in the dark. The heavy oak front door was forced open from the outside 2 minutes later. Mr. Henderson stepped into the smoke-filled living room, draped in a heavy yellow slicker, holding a loaded 12-gauge shotgun low against his hip. Behind him, the floodlights of his vintage John Deere tractor cut through the dark, illuminating the destruction, the splintered wood, the shattered glass, and the lingering cloud of orange sulfur from the flare. "Chloe!" His rough voice boomed over the wind. "Chloe, where are you?" I kicked open what was left of the bathroom door, stumbling out into the hallway, coughing violently as the fresh air hit my lungs. When Mr. Henderson saw me, drenched in sweat, covered in soot, and holding the empty flare tube, he lowered the gun, his weathered face pale with shock. I didn't ask questions. He guided me out to the tractor's enclosed cab, wrapped me in a wool blanket, and used his heavy CB radio, which operated on a low-frequency band untouched by the cell tower outage, to call the county sheriff. It took the police nearly 3 hours to clear the mudslide and reach the property. They found the intruder less than half a mile down the dirt road. He hadn't made it far. The burn on his forearm was severe, and in his blind panic to escape through the pitch-black woods during the gale, he had slipped down an embankment, snapping his left ankle against an exposed tree root. He was sitting in the mud, shivering violently from hypothermia when the deputies found him. His name was Thomas Vance. He wasn't a local, and he hadn't just stumbled onto our farm because his truck broke down. When the state troopers finally towed his beat-up Ford pickup out of a ditch 2 miles back, they made a discovery that sent a chill straight through the county police department. Inside the cab, under a tarp, they found a regional topo map. Circled in red marker were 12 different rural properties across 3 counties. All of them isolated, set back from main roads, and occupied by women or elderly residents living alone. Our house was number 8. 4 of the other circled properties had experienced unsolved residential burglaries and violent home invasions over the past 2 years. Every single one occurring during major winter storms or severe weather events when local emergency services were paralyzed. He had been tracking weather patterns for years, using the chaos of nature as his personal camouflage. I was sentenced to 24 years in a maximum security state facility without the possibility of early parole. It's been 3 years since that night. I graduated from college, moved to a dense Midwestern city, and took a job at an environmental firm. I live on the 8th floor of a secure, concrete high-rise building with 24-hour lobby security, keycard-only elevators, and 3 separate deadbolts on my front door. My parents eventually sold the farm. They couldn't stand walking past the back porch or looking at the woodshed anymore. On paper, the threat is eliminated. Thomas Vance is behind iron bars in a facility 300 miles away. I took self-defense classes. I built a normal life. But trauma doesn't care about court verdicts or high-rise security systems. Every time a thunderstorm rolls over the city, my chest tightens until I can barely draw breath. While normal people sit on their couches listening to the cozy sound of rain against the window panes, I sit in the center of my living room, far away from any glass, counting the seconds between the lightning and the thunder. And last month, something happened that stripped away whatever fragile sense of safety I had rebuilt. I received a thick manila envelope in the mail, forwarded from my old college campus address. Inside was a standard notification packet from the State Department of Corrections, a routine victim impact update regarding Vance's incarceration status. As I unfolded the official court documents, a small square piece of paper slipped out from between the pages and fell onto my rug. It wasn't an official state form. It was a Polaroid photo taken from inside a dark room looking out a window. Printed on the bottom margin of the photo, in messy, familiar black ink, were 3 short sentences. The storm always passes, Chloe. Prisons have power outages too. See you on the next rainy night. The bright yellow canister of the air horn sat on the shelf like a beacon. Beside it lay a thick orange plastic tube, a marine signal flare with a pull-string igniter. My dad kept them in the powder room near the back exit for summer trips to the Sound. Bang! The heavy wood door bowed inward. A sharp crack echoed through the tiny bathroom as the frame splintered near the top hinge. "You think this door is going to hold, Chloe?" His voice rasped from the hallway. "I've got 3 hours before sunrise. I can chop through this frame with a butter knife if I have to." I didn't answer him. I grabbed the air horn with my left hand and the flare tube with my right. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the small brass pull pin on the flare. I looked up at the ceiling. In the corner of the small bathroom was a narrow, 8-inch aluminum ventilation duct that ran horizontally out to the side wall of the house, designed to pull moisture out from the shower. It opened directly onto the side yard, pointing down the hill toward Mr. Henderson's property. Mr. Henderson was 72, a light sleeper, and a former Navy radar operator. If there was one sound that man knew, it was a maritime distress blast. I stood on the edge of the toilet seat, balancing myself against the wall, and shoved the plastic nozzle of the air horn directly into the metal opening of the vent duct. I pressed down hard on the trigger. The sound inside the small enclosed bathroom was deafening. A piercing, bone-rattling 120 decibel shriek that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. The metal duct amplified the noise, channeling the blast like a trumpet out into the storm. Outside the door, I heard him let out a sharp curse and stumble back, caught off guard by the sheer, agonizing volume echoing down the narrow hallway. I held the horn down for 10 agonizing seconds, releasing it briefly to let the canister recharge, then slammed it down again. "Stop it!" he roared, throwing his entire body against the door in a rage. Crack! The top hinge sheared clean off the wall. The door tilted inward at a terrifying 45-degree angle, held only by the bottom latch. Through the wide gap at the top, I saw his mud-stained face, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his mouth twisted into a snarl of pure fury. He thrust his arm through the opening, reaching blindly down toward the interior lock. His fingers grazed the brass deadbolt. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the string on the marine signal flare. A sharp pop filled the room, followed immediately by a brilliant, blinding hiss of sulfurous orange fire. White smoke erupted from the tip, instantly filling the powder room with a thick, choking cloud. The temperature in the room spiked instantly. I jammed the flaming, 2,000-degree tip of the signal flare straight into the gap at the top of the door, pressing it directly against his outstretched forearm. He let out a guttural, horrific scream of pain as the intense chemical fire burned straight through his oilskin coat and into his skin. The smell of scorched fabric and burnt flesh filled the air. He yanked his arm back through the gap, staggering backward into the hallway, swearing violently as he beat out the flames on his sleeve. "You crazy bitch!" he howled from the living room, his voice strained and ragged. "You burned me! I have 2 more!" I screamed through the smoke, coughing hard, holding the air horn back up to the vent. I pressed the nozzle down again, letting the piercing shriek roar out into the night sky, over and over, pulsing 3 long blasts. The universal code for distress. Through the roaring wind, the pounding rain, and the screech of the air horn, a new sound began to slice through the storm. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from the dirt road outside. I held my breath, lowering the horn slightly. Thump, 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 thump. It was the heavy, twin-cylinder engine of a vintage John Deere tractor. Mr. Henderson. Through the tiny cracks in the broken bathroom door, I saw a sudden flash of bright white light sweep across the living room walls. The tractor's powerful front floodlights were shining straight through the front windows of the house. A high-pitched, warbling siren echoed from the driveway. Mr. Henderson's old farm horn blaring continuously. In the hallway, the intruder went dead silent. Through the smoke, I saw his shadow move rapidly away from the bathroom door, retreating toward the kitchen. He knew the illusion of his absolute isolation was gone. The storm was no longer hiding him, it was trapping him. He scrambled toward the dining room, smashing a side window frame with the hilt of the hunting knife, and threw himself out into the freezing mud and darkness just as the heavy footsteps of boots mounted the front porch steps. The piece of cardboard sat on the counter like a venomous insect. The ink on the letters was still damp, bleeding into the fibrous brown edges where rain had dripped off someone's sleeve. I found a dry place. A wave of nausea washed over me so violently that I had to grab the edge of the sink to keep my knees from buckling. He was inside. He had been inside while I was down in the basement. He had stood in my kitchen, looked at my cold mug of coffee, and left a note on the counter just to let me know how effortlessly he could reach me. My home, the safe, solid place where I had grown up, had suddenly turned into a death trap. Every dark doorway looked like a maw. Every shadow behind the furniture felt like a hiding figure. I gripped the steel wrench until my fingers went completely numb. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in this house. The storm raging outside was terrifying, but the freezing rain was nothing compared to the predator moving through my hallway. I backed toward the mudroom door, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark corridor that led to the bedrooms. I reached behind me, my left hand blindly groping for the brass handle of the back exit. My fingers wrapped around the lever. I pressed down. It didn't budge. I frowned, turning slightly to look. The brass deadbolt was pulled back, completely disengaged, but the handle wouldn't turn. I grabbed it with both hands, placing my boot against the frame, and yanked with all my weight. The handle gave a sickening snap. The latch inside the door mechanism had been jammed. From the outside or the inside, someone had jammed a hardened steel pin directly into the keyway, seizing the lock mechanism permanently. I hadn't just broken in, he had locked me in. Panic, hot and suffocating, surged through my chest. I sprinted toward the front door in the living room, my boots sliding across the hardwood floor. I threw myself against the heavy oak front door and slammed the handle down. Nothing. The front lock was jammed too, the same cold metallic resistance. "No, no, no, please," I sobbed, pounding my fist against the thick wood. I was trapped. The large glass windows in the living room were an option, but they were reinforced double-pane storm windows. Shattering them without heavy tools would take time, make an agonizing amount of noise, and leave me crawling through sharp glass into a storm where he could easily tackle me from behind. Squeak. The sound came from the end of the long hallway leading to the master bedroom. It was the distinct, high-pitched friction of a wet rubber boot turning slowly on polished wood. I whipped around, raising the lantern. The light cut through the black corridor, illuminating the framed family photos lining the wall. My dad holding a fish, my mom smiling at my graduation, me as a kid on a tire swing. At the far end of the hall, standing in the doorway of my parents' bedroom, was a figure. I was broad-shouldered and tall, draped in a filthy dark oilskin coat that dripped rainwater onto the runner rug beneath his feet. A wet canvas cap was pulled low over his forehead, casting his eyes in deep, impenetrable shadow. But under the brim, in the yellow glow of my lantern, I could see the lower half of his face. I was grinning. It wasn't a psychotic, manic grin. It was a calm, satisfied, terrifyingly normal smile. His beard was patchy, matted with mud and rain, and his breathing came in slow, heavy rasps, like a bellows opening and closing. In his right hand, he held my father's heavy brass hunting knife, the one usually kept in a locked glass display case in the den. "You've got a tight little house here, girl," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, completely unhurried. He spoke with the slow cadence of a man who knew he had all the time in the world. Warm, dry. Takes a lot of work to keep a place like this running during a blowout storm. "Get out!" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper before I forced myself to scream it. "Get out of my house!" I took a slow step forward. The floorboards under his heavy work boots groaned in protest. "Now why would I do that?" he asked softly, tilting his head. "It's nasty out there. Trees coming down everywhere. Roads completely blocked a mile up by a mudslide. No cars getting through tonight. No police. No neighbors." I took another step. He was 15 feet away now. "I tried sleeping in your shed," he continued, flicking his thumb against the flat edge of the hunting knife. "But the wind was whistling through the boards. Then I saw you come out in your little raincoat, and I realized I didn't need to stay in the shed." I didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. I didn't try to attack him with the wrench. He was twice my size, armed with a longer blade, and had the physical advantage. Instead, I did the only thing my instincts told me to do. I hurled the heavy steel wrench straight at his face with everything I had. He ducked instinctively, raising his arm to block it. The wrench struck his shoulder with a dull thud, making him grunt in surprise. In that split second of distraction, I turned and bolted into the narrow hallway off the living room, heading for the smallest, most secure room in the house, the utility bathroom. It was a windowless, concrete-reinforced powder room my dad had built near the center of the house during a remodel. It had a heavy, solid wood core door and an industrial-grade brass deadbolt on the inside. I threw myself inside, slammed the heavy door shut, and threw the interior deadbolt. The metal latch clicked home with a heavy, satisfying sound, just a fraction of a second before a massive shoulder slammed into the outside panels. Bang! The door frame shuddered, dust falling from the ceiling trim, but the solid wood held. "Open the door, Chloe!" His voice came from the other side, dangerously close, pressed right against the wood. My heart stopped. I had used my name. I hadn't told him my name. There was no mailbox with my first name on it outside. I knew who I was. "You left your college ID on the kitchen counter next to your laptop," he whispered through the crack in the doorframe, his voice sickeningly sweet. "Chloe, it's a nice name. Sounds gentle." I backed away from the door until my spine hit the cold tile wall behind the sink. I was hyperventilating, air tearing through my throat in ragged, useless gasps. I was locked in a box, safe for the moment, but completely trapped. No phone, no windows, no way out. And then, staring at the small emergency shelf under the mirror, my eyes landed on a bright yellow object resting beside the extra towels. It was my dad's boat kit, a high-decibel compressed air horn used for maritime emergencies, along with a heavy-duty signal flare. I froze, the breath catching in my throat so sharply it hurt. The darkness in the kitchen was total, punctuated only by the strobing flashes of lightning through the window frames. Every muscle in my body turned to iron. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again. 3 distinct, deliberate raps against the glass. A beat of quiet. Then 3 more. I forced my hand to drop into my pocket, my fingers finding the hard aluminum casing of a small emergency flashlight my dad kept on the counter. I clicked it on, keeping my thumb partially over the lens to muffle the beam to a dull orange glow. I crept slowly toward the kitchen sink, raising the light just enough to illuminate the glass pane of the window. The glass was streaked with horizontal sheets of rain, blurred and distorted. Outside, the black shapes of the pine trees thrashed wild against the sky. I held the light steady, peering through the glass into the storm. Nothing was there, just the empty wooden deck, gleaming slick under the rain. I exhaled a ragged breath, my shoulders slumping slightly. "It's the storm," I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. "It's just a branch, or hail. It has to be." I tried to convince myself, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I backed away from the window, turning toward the hallway closet where my father kept the emergency equipment. I pulled out a heavy-duty camping lantern, a box of matches, and a portable emergency hand-crank radio. I set the lantern in the middle of the kitchen table. Its warm, white LED light flooded the room, driving back the terrifying blackness and giving the familiar wooden cabinets a sense of safety. I turned the knob on the crank radio, extending the silver antenna, and searched through the static for the local weather channel. All I got was a wall of harsh white noise, broken occasionally by bursts of distorted audio. Warning extended, trees down on Route 9, crews unable to. The static hissed and cracked, then cut out entirely. The battery was dead. I grabbed the side handle to start hand cranking it, but paused. Through the static of the radio, I heard a sound from the basement. It was a dull, rhythmic thud. It sounded like heavy wood hitting concrete, followed by the faint, unmistakable scraping of metal on floorboards. My heart did a terrifying leap into my throat. The basement was accessible from inside the house via a door in the mudroom, but it also had an exterior storm cellar entrance. A pair of heavy iron doors set flat against the ground on the side of the house. Had I locked the storm doors? I couldn't remember. My dad usually kept them bolted from the inside, but if he had been hauling equipment out before his trip, he might have left the interior latch slid open. I picked up the camping lantern in one hand and grabbed a heavy steel wrench from my dad's toolbox on the pantry shelf. I crept toward the mudroom, my rubber-soled boots making soft, squeaking noises on the linoleum. The basement door was shut. The brass knob glinted in the lantern light. I stood in front of the door for a full minute, listening intently. Below the floorboards, the house was silent, save for the dull vibration of the wind pounding against the foundation walls. I reached out, wrapped my fingers around the cold brass knob, and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a yawning void of pitch-black darkness stretching down the steep wooden stairs into the cellar. I raised the lantern, shining the beam down the wooden steps. "Is anyone down there?" I called out, trying to sound firm, authoritative, like someone who wasn't terrified out of her mind. My voice bounced off the stone walls and died. No response. I took 2 steps down the wooden stairs, the wood groaning loudly under my weight. The air down here was cold, smelling of damp soil, old paint cans, and coal dust. I swept the lantern beam across the space. The washing machine sat in the corner. Stacks of plastic storage bins lined the walls. Everything looked normal. I walked toward the far side of the basement, where the metal storm cellar doors were located. The heavy iron bar that secured the doors from the inside was resting securely in its steel brackets. It was bolted shut. I let out a shuddering sigh of relief. No one had come in through the basement. I was letting my imagination run wild. The noise had probably just been a loose shutter or a falling tool knocked over by the wind, vibrating the foundation. I turned back towards the stairs, ready to go back up, lock the basement door, and wait out the storm in the living room with a blanket. Then I saw it. On the 3rd step from the bottom of the wooden staircase, right in the center of the step, was a wet footprint. It wasn't mine. The tread pattern was deep, aggressive, heavy work boot ridges, far larger than my small rubber soles. Beside the footprint was a small puddle of mud, still fresh, water glistening under the light of my lantern. The track didn't come from the cellar doors. It came from the top of the stairs. Someone had walked down these stairs, stepped onto the concrete, and was currently somewhere in the dark basement with me. My blood turned to liquid ice. My throat seized, locking the air inside my lungs. I raised the lantern frantically, sweeping the light across the shadow-drenched corners of the room, behind the water heater, behind the stacks of storage boxes, behind the old coal chute. Nothing. The shadows stretched and twisted as I moved the light, but the room appeared empty. Then, from the dark rafters directly above my head, came a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard in the kitchen above me. Someone hadn't stayed down here. They had walked up into my house while I was checking the cellar doors. I didn't scream. I couldn't. Fear had turned my mouth completely dry. I turned and scrambled up the basement stairs as fast as I could, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. I reached the top of the stairs, threw myself into the mudroom, slammed the basement door shut, and threw the slide bolt into place. I turned around, holding the wrench high in front of me, sweeping the lantern light around the kitchen. The room was empty. The back door was still locked. But as the lantern light brushed past the kitchen counter, my eyes landed on something that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. Sitting right beside my tea mug was my dad's heavy iron keyring, the one he always kept hooked to his belt loop. Resting right next to the keys was a small, wet piece of torn cardboard. Written on it, in thick, smeared black permanent marker, were 4 simple words: I found a dry place. The delivery app notified me that my order had been successfully delivered. But I hadn't opened my door, and there wasn't a single bag sitting on my welcome mat. Living on the ground floor of a massive city apartment complex teaches you to be cautious. You learn to double-check the window latches before turning off the lights. You learn to pull the blinds shut the moment the sun goes down. But you also rely on the illusion of safety that comes with living surrounded by hundreds of neighbors. My name is Maya. I'm a 20-year-old data analyst, and 2 months ago, I moved into Unit 104, a small ground-floor studio apartment in the Oak Ridge Terrace complex. It was my first time living completely on my own. The studio was compact, but it was cheap, modern, and had a large glass window that faced a quiet concrete courtyard breezeway. Because I worked long hours, analyzing remote code databases, I ordered takeout almost every night. It was a routine I didn't think twice about. Open the app, select a meal, wait for the chime on my phone, step out into the hallway or courtyard, grab the brown paper bag, and eat at my desk. It was a chilly Tuesday evening in late October, right around 8:45 p.m. The weather outside was dismal, a steady, freezing drizzle that made the concrete courtyard gleam under the tall security lamps. I had ordered a bowl of warm ramen from a local shop 3 miles away. I sat at my desk in my gray fleece pullover, working through a spreadsheet while keeping an eye on the driver's GPS icon on my phone screen. The app showed the driver, a man listed as David with a 4.9 star rating, approaching my street on a scooter. I watched the little green icon slide down Elm Street, turn onto the alleyway behind my building, and pause. 10 seconds later, my phone buzzed on the desk. A push notification popped up across the top of my screen. Your order has been dropped off at your door. Enjoy your meal. Attached was the standard automated photo verification taken by the driver. A close-up shot of a brown paper bag sitting on a dark gray doormat with the number 104 clearly visible. I stretched my arms, unlatched my front door, and stepped out into the hallway. The hallway was completely empty. I looked down at my welcome mat. The damp gray fabric was bare. There was no bag, no steam rising from hot broth, no napkin, nothing. What the? I muttered, stepping out into the middle of the corridor. I checked the doors to my left and right. Units 102 and 106 had clean, empty mats. I walked down to the end of the hall, thinking the driver might have accidentally left it near the elevator bank. Nothing. I opened my phone app again and tapped the verification photo to enlarge it. The image showed my mat and my door number, 104. But as I zoomed in on the bottom edge of the photo, something felt off. The lighting in the picture was bright and warm, like afternoon sunlight. The floor in the photo was bone dry. Outside, it had been pouring rain for 3 straight hours. The floor mats in the ground floor hallway were damp from residents walking in with wet boots. The photo the driver had uploaded wasn't taken 5 seconds ago. It was a pre-saved, cached image taken on a dry, sunny day. My phone chimed again. A text message from the driver appeared inside the app's internal chat interface. "Driver, sorry about that. Dropped at front door mat. Have a good night." I quickly typed back, "Maya. Hi, I'm standing at door 104 right now. There is no bag here. Did you leave it somewhere else?" No answer. The driver's profile icon immediately went offline, marking the order as completed. I let out an annoyed sigh. Great, I thought. A lazy driver took a fake photo, stole my $20 dinner, and drove off. It was frustrating. But in a city of 3 million people, gig app petty theft wasn't unheard of. I went back inside my studio, locked the front deadbolt, and opened the food app support page to request a full refund. Because my studio was on the ground floor, my desk sat directly beside the large glass window overlooking the side courtyard. The blinds were pulled down, but the horizontal plastic slats were tilted slightly open to let in a bit of cool air. While waiting for the support bot to process my claim, I heard a faint sound outside my window. It wasn't the sound of rain hitting the glass. It was a wet, heavy shoe stepping onto the gravel path directly beneath my window pane, less than 2 feet from where my head was resting against the desk chair. I froze. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Outside, in the dark concrete alleyway, a shadow blocked the faint amber light filtering through my plastic blinds. Someone was standing outside in the pouring rain, perfectly still, leaning forward toward the glass. I sat motionless in my desk chair, every muscle in my body locking up. The shadow outside my window didn't move. Through the thin horizontal gaps in my plastic blinds, I could see the dark outline of a tall figure wearing a heavy hooded rain jacket. He was standing less than 20 inches away from me, separated only by a single pane of double-glazed glass and a flimsy aluminum flip latch. I wasn't walking past. He wasn't looking for a lost set of keys. His face was turned directly toward my window frame, his body angled forward as if trying to peer through the narrow slats of the blinds into my lit studio apartment. My heart hammered against my ribs. Slowly, painfully slowly, I slid my feet back along the rug, keeping my weight off the squeaky floorboards, and ducked beneath the height of the desk. I reached up, grabbed the wand for the blinds, and twisted it sharply, snapping the plastic slats completely shut. Outside, the silhouette shifted instantly. I heard the sharp, wet crunch of gravel as his boots turned toward the concrete breezeway, followed by the retreating splash of footsteps fading down the dark alleyway. "Just a weird shortcut," I whispered to myself, sitting on the floor behind my desk, holding my knees against my chest. People cut through the courtyard all the time to avoid the street rain. I tried to force my brain to accept the logical explanation. The delivery driver had stolen my food, and some random pedestrian had walked down the side alley to get out of the storm. 2 separate, unfortunate events happening 10 minutes apart. It had to be a coincidence. I stood up, checked that the flip latch on the glass window was turned to the locked position, and pulled the heavy blackout curtains across the entire frame. To give myself peace of mind, I opened the mobile app connected to my smart video doorbell. 2 weeks after moving in, my dad had insisted on installing a compact, battery-powered HD camera right beside my apartment door frame. It monitored the hallway and captured any motion within 8 feet. I opened the event log for the last hour. There were 2 motion clips recorded between 8:30 p.m. and 8:45 p.m. I tapped the first video time-stamped at 8:41 p.m., the exact minute my food was marked as delivered. The video loaded in crisp 1080p resolution. A tall man stepped into the camera's frame in the hallway outside Unit 104. He was wearing a dark blue hooded rain jacket, black cargo pants, and mud-stained work boots. A dark medical mask covered the lower half of his face, and a black baseball cap was pulled low over his forehead. I was holding a brown paper bag from the ramen restaurant in his right hand. In his left hand, he held his smartphone. But instead of setting the bag down on my welcome mat, taking a picture, and leaving, he did something that made my skin crawl. He pulled a laminated piece of paper out of his jacket pocket. A printed photograph of my doormat and the number 104, taken during daylight hours. He held the photo directly in front of his phone camera lens, snapped a picture of the paper, and tapped his screen to upload it to the delivery app. He never intended to drop off the food. He had used a fake pre-printed photo to trick the app's automated verification algorithm. Then, the man turned away from my door. But he didn't walk toward the main entrance exit or the elevator. In the video, he walked slowly down the hallway toward the emergency exit door that led directly out to the side courtyard, the exact area where my bedroom window was located. Before pushing the fire door open, he stopped under the hallway light, pulled down his medical mask, and looked straight into my doorbell camera lens. I didn't look startled or confused. He stared directly into the lens for 3 long seconds, his eyes cold, narrow, and completely unblinking. Then he raised his phone, aimed his screen at my door frame as if taking a photo of my unit number, pulled his mask back up, and stepped out into the dark courtyard. It was the same man who had been standing outside my window 2 minutes later. My hands shook as I closed the doorbell app. This wasn't a lazy driver stealing a $20 meal. This was deliberate, calculated reconnaissance. I opened my phone's call app and dialed the customer support line for the food delivery service. After 4 minutes of navigating automated menus, a representative finally answered with a casual, bored tone. "Hi," I said, my voice tight and trembling. "I need to report a driver immediately. The man assigned to my order, David, just used a fraudulent photo to complete my delivery, and then he was caught on my security camera creeping around my ground floor windows." "I'm so sorry to hear that, ma'am," the agent replied in a rehearsed monotone. "I can certainly issue a full refund to your original payment method for the undelivered items." "I don't care about the refund," I snapped, pacing back and forth across my tiny studio floor. "This driver used your platform to get access to my secure building, fake a drop-off, and lurk outside my bedroom window. I need you to identify who he is and contact the police." There was a long pause on the line, followed by the sound of rapid keyboard clacking. "Ma'am, looking at the driver account for David, this profile was registered using a third-party contractor license in a different city," the representative said softly, her tone suddenly changing from bored to nervous. "The account was flagged for an identity verification check 10 minutes ago and has been suspended. The phone number linked to the account is a burner line." "What does that mean?" I asked, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "It means..." The agent hesitated. "It means the person who took your order wasn't David. Someone else was using his account credentials." I hung up the phone, standing in the middle of my quiet studio while the rain lashed against the exterior walls. The driver wasn't an employee who had gone rogue. He was a ghost operating behind stolen credentials, using a delivery app as a legal passport to enter secure residential complexes, map out ground floor units, and target women living alone. I stared at the blackout curtains covering my bay window. The thin glass pane felt less like a barrier and more like a plastic wrap waiting to be punctured. I grabbed my laptop, pulled up a new document, and began exporting every video clip from my smart video doorbell. If I was going to the police, I needed a complete timeline. I scrubbed through the doorbell footage from the past 3 days, looking for any other anomalies. My heart stopped at the entry time stamped Sunday, October 22, 4 days ago, at 9:15 p.m. On Sunday, I had ordered a sandwich from a completely different delivery app. The driver assigned to that order was listed as Sarah. I clicked play on the archived Sunday clip. A figure wearing a bright green courier jacket stepped into the hallway, carrying a brown paper bag. But as the person stood under the fluorescent light, I realized the green jacket was unzipped over a dark blue hooded raincoat. The person pulled off a blonde wig and medical mask, revealing the exact same sharp jawline, narrow eyes, and mud-stained work boots of the man from tonight. He had come to my door 4 days ago under a completely different account name, on a completely different app platform. On Sunday, I had opened the door while he was standing there. I remembered smiling, saying thank you, and taking the bag directly from his hands. During those 5 seconds, while the door was wide open, he hadn't just been delivering a sandwich. He had been looking past my shoulder, scanning the layout of my studio, noting the position of my desk, checking if there were male boots near the entrance, and seeing that I lived completely alone. I had been building a profile on me for nearly a week. A cold, visceral terror washed over me. I ran over to my front door and double-checked the deadbolt, sliding the safety chain into its slot. Then I walked back to the bay window, carefully pulling back the edge of the blackout curtain by a fraction of an inch to peer out into the dark alleyway. The courtyard was black, save for the flickering amber security lamp 60 feet away near the dumpsters. The rain was coming down harder now, hammering against the concrete pavement. Squeak! A sound came from the exterior window frame, right in front of my face. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct sound of rubber pressing against glass. I looked down at the bottom sill of my window pane, through the clear glass, illuminated by the faint glow of my indoor desk lamp. I saw 5 dark, greasy smudges appearing on the glass surface. Someone outside was pressing his bare fingertips against the glass, pushing upward with heavy, deliberate force, testing if the interior flip latch would yield under pressure. "Stop!" I screamed, slamming my hand hard against the inside of the glass pane. Bang! The hand retracted instantly into the darkness. I didn't pause to see where he went. I scrambled across the floor, grabbed my phone from the desk, and dialed 911. "Mowan, what is your emergency?" A dispatcher's voice echoed through the speaker. "I need police at Oak Ridge Terrace, Unit 104. I gasped, my chest heaving as I hid behind the drywall partition dividing my kitchen and sleeping area. "There is a man trying to force open my ground floor bedroom window. He's been stalking me through fake delivery app accounts." "Ma'am, stay on the line," the dispatcher said calmly. "Are your doors and windows locked?" "Yes, but the window latch is weak," I cried, tears finally stinging my eyes. "He was just outside pressing on the glass. He knows I'm alone. Units are being dispatched to your location. Stay low, stay away from the windows, and do not open the door for anyone, unless they identify as law enforcement." While the dispatcher spoke, a soft, dry click echoed from the front entryway of my apartment. I turned my head toward the door. My front door handle was slowly turning downward. Click, click. Someone had entered the secure building hallway again. He wasn't outside the window anymore. I was standing on my welcome mat on the other side of the thin wooden door, gently testing the latch mechanism with a metallic tension tool. He had a master bump key or a lockpick set. "He's at my front door," I whispered into the phone, my voice dropping to a terrified whimper as I backed into the dark kitchen corner, clutching a heavy stainless steel chef's knife from the block. "He's trying to pick the deadbolt. Officers are 2 minutes away, ma'am. Hold tight. Help is on the way." Through the thin wooden door panel, I heard a low, raspy whisper. The voice of the man from the delivery profile. "Maya," he said softly, his tone terribly flat and devoid of anger. "You shouldn't have closed the blinds. I just need to take a few photos of the interior floorboards." The metal deadbolt inside my door frame gave a heavy, sickening clack. The brass cylinder rotated fully to the unlocked position. The door swung inward 2 inches, stopped only by the thin nickel safety chain I had latched minutes before. Through the 2-inch vertical gap, a single dark eye framed by a blue hood appeared in the dim hallway light, staring directly into the dark kitchen where I stood holding the knife. "There you are," he whispered. The nickel safety chain creaked under the weight of the door resting against it. Through that 2-inch vertical crack, I saw his dark blue hood, his cold, narrow eyes, and the greasy black fabric of his gloved hand reaching through the gap to feel for the door chain's slider mechanism. "I have a knife!" I screamed, my voice cracking with pure terror as I lunged forward into the entryway, raising the steel chef's knife high above my head. "Get the heck away from my door!" I drove the heavy metal handle of the knife downward with all my strength, slamming it straight onto his exposed fingers resting on the door frame. Bang! He let out a sharp, muffled curse as his gloved hand snapped back out into the hallway. "Crazy freak!" he hissed from the other side of the wood. Instead of retreating, he threw his shoulder violently against the center door panel. Thump! The thin nickel chain strained against the door frame, the top metal screw pulling 3 millimeters out of the soft wood molding with a horrifying splintering sound. Paint dust rained down on my hair. Thump! 911 is on the line, I shrieked, backing into the kitchen as the chain gave another agonizing groaning sound. "They are entering the complex right now." Outside the building, the faint, wailing scream of police sirens began to echo down Elm Street, their high-pitched tones bouncing off the concrete alleyway walls outside my window. Red and blue light bars flickered across the blackout curtains in my living room, casting chaotic, swirling shadows against my walls. The man at the door froze. I didn't scream. He didn't try to kick the chain a third time. I heard his heavy work boots turn sharply on the hallway runner rug, followed by the fast, rhythmic thud of his footsteps, sprinting down the corridor toward the rear emergency fire exit. 10 seconds later, heavy boots thundered down the main hallway from the front lobby. "Police, open up!" a loud, commanding voice bellowed, followed by 2 sharp knuckles pounding against my door frame. Bang, bang, bang! Oak Ridge Police Department. Is anyone hurt inside? Tears burst from my eyes as my body went completely limp. I stumbled to the door, slithered the bent safety chain out of its bracket, and threw the door open. 2 uniformed police officers stood in the hallway, their heavy flashlights drawn and illuminated, their hands resting on their sidearms. "He went out the back fire exit," I sobbed, pointing down the hall toward the heavy metal door, resting half open at the end of the corridor. "He tried to pick my lock. He had a knife or a tool." "Officer Perez, check the alley. I've got the victim," the senior officer commanded into his shoulder radio as he stepped inside my studio to secure the room. Within 5 minutes, 3 more patrol units arrived, sealing off the courtyard, the parking garage, and the alleyway surrounding the Oak Ridge Terrace complex. Because the storm was pouring rain and the ground floor courtyard was confined by tall concrete walls, the intruder hadn't been able to scale the perimeter security fence in time. Officer Perez caught him, crouched behind the industrial recycling dumpster in the side alley, drenched in rain, trying to strip off his dark blue raincoat and hide his face. The police brought him back through the lobby in heavy steel handcuffs. As 2 officers held him against the brick wall near the mailboxes, a detective walked over to me with a clear plastic evidence bag recovered from his rain jacket pockets. "Ma'am, do you know this man?" the detective asked softly. I looked at the suspect. Without his hood and mask, I saw a pale, gaunt man in his early 30s, with receded brown hair and dark circles beneath his eyes. I had never seen his face before in my life. "No," I whispered, shivering inside my wool blanket. "I've never seen him. But he delivered a sandwich to my door on Sunday under a woman's name." The detective unzipped the evidence bag and pulled out a black digital camera, 3 USB thumb drives, a set of precision lockpicks, and a small handheld digital floor scanner, a device used by interior contractors to measure room dimensions through drywall. "His name is Kenneth Royce," the detective said, his expression grim. "And he's not just a gig app thief." The truth revealed over the next 2 hours was far more insidious than a random stalker picking a ground floor window. Kenneth Royce wasn't working alone, nor was he operating entirely on his own impulses. He was part of an organized network operating on dark web real estate forums. Bad actors traded stolen gig worker accounts to target specific high-density apartment complexes. They would accept orders for ground floor units occupied by single tenants, taking hidden photos of floor layouts, door locks, and window frame models. They compiled these photos into digital occupancy dossiers and sold them online to local burglary rings looking for easy ground floor entries. "I wasn't trying to break in to harm you tonight, Maya," the detective explained, showing me a printout of the file recovered from Kenneth's phone. "I was gathering real-time interior photos of your floorboard framing to verify where your landlord had installed the new electrical wiring." I stared at the detective, my mind spinning. Why? Why my apartment? The detective looked at the doorway of Unit 104, then back at me. "Because 6 months ago, before you moved in, Unit 104 was occupied by a former financial manager who went to federal prison for grand larceny," the detective said quietly. "Kenneth wasn't stalking you. He was hired by a third party to locate $40,000 in physical bearer bonds hidden beneath the floorboards of this studio before the lease was turned over to a new tenant. Every strange delivery, every photo, every lingering look through my window. It had all been a calculated treasure hunt, and I had been sleeping directly on top of the prize. The police investigation turned my studio inside out over the next 3 days. Federal agents brought in flooring specialists who pried up the tongue-and-groove hardwood beneath my desk. Sure enough, tucked into a hollowed-out section of the subfloor joists directly below where I sat every night to do my work, they found a water-resistant steel box containing the missing bearer bonds and $50,000 in unmarked currency. My landlord terminated my lease without penalty, deeply embarrassed and terrified of a massive lawsuit. He paid for a moving crew to pack up my belongings and transport them to a secure second-story apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood 20 miles away. Kenneth Royce pleaded guilty to felony burglary, possession of burglary tools, identity theft, and stalking. His arrest triggered a massive federal task force that shut down 2 major dark web forums and resulted in the indictment of 11 individuals involved in the illegal gig account syndicate. I thought moving to a higher floor, miles away from the city center, would fix the constant knot in my stomach. I thought knowing the motivation behind the terror, that it was about money, not me, would bring me peace. I installed 3 deadbolts on my new front door. I put high-decibel window sensors on every frame, even though I was on the 2nd floor. I uninstalled every food delivery app from my phone, swore off takeout entirely, and began buying my groceries in person during broad daylight. For nearly 10 months, I managed to build something resembling a normal life again. I finished my degree, got a full-time position as a remote database architect, and slowly stopped checking my doorbell camera every 5 minutes. I truly believed I was safe. Until 2 nights ago. It was a quiet Thursday evening, around 9:20 p.m. A heavy thunderstorm was passing over the suburb, the rain drumming softly against my 2nd-story living room window. I was sitting at my new dining table, working on my laptop, sipping tea. My phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was an incoming call from a local landline number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would ignore calls from unknown numbers, but thinking it might be my landlord regarding a maintenance request for the building's water heater, I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said. Silence filled the line, not the dead silence of a dropped call or a disconnect, but the hollow, ambient silence of a live connection. Through the receiver, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of rain. The exact same rainstorm falling outside my living room window. "Who is this?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone casing, the old familiar knot returning to my throat. A voice spoke. It wasn't Kenneth Royce. It was a woman's voice, smooth, polite, and completely calm, spoken with the practiced cadence of a customer service representative. "Good evening, Maya," she said softly. "We're reaching out from regional support. We noticed you deleted your delivery profile last year." My breath hitched in my chest. "How did you get this unlisted number?" "We just wanted to verify that your new 2nd-floor dining table setup is working out for you," the woman continued, her tone remaining horrifyingly cheerful. "The lighting in your new place is much better than Unit 104. Though, you really shouldn't leave your balcony door unlatched when it rains." I dropped the phone onto the wooden dining table as if it had turned into a burning ember. I scrambled out of my chair, my heart leaping into my throat, and sprinted into the dark hallway leading to my apartment's private rear balcony. The heavy glass sliding door leading out to the balcony was shut. But as I reached for the handle, I saw it. The silver locking lever was flipped up into the unlocked position. Glued to the glass pane on the inside of my locked balcony door, right at eye level, was a tiny, printed square of paper. It was a high-resolution, close-up photograph of my new welcome mat, taken from inside my hallway 10 minutes ago while I was sitting at the table with my headphones on. Underneath the picture, printed in neat black text, were 2 words, "Delivery complete." I backed away into the dark corridor, staring at the glass, clutching my chest as the rain lashed against the exterior railing. Kenneth Royce was behind bars. The dark web forum had been seized. The money beneath the floorboards was sitting in a federal evidence vault, and as I stood alone in the dark, listening to the floorboards of the apartment complex groan in the wind, I realized the ultimate paralyzing truth. They never cared about the money. They just realized how easy it was to get inside. Three sheriff's cruisers and an ambulance turned Loop B into a blinding storm of red and blue light within 10 minutes. Paramedics wrapped me in a thick thermal shock blanket inside the back of an ambulance, while deputies set up a perimeter around the edge of the woods behind the bathhouse. They brought in K9 tracking units to sweep the ridge where Russell had disappeared, but the heavy downpour washed away his scent trail within an hour, allowing him to melt into the vast, dark expanse of the national forest. At dawn, 3 detectives walked me back to my rented camper van to inventory the damage and process the crime scene. The driver's side window was completely pulverized. glass shards glittering like ice across the steering wheel and floorboards. But what the lead detective found stuffed inside the glove compartment of my van brought a sickening wave of nausea straight back to my throat. While I was running toward the bathhouse, Russell hadn't immediately chased me. He had taken 20 seconds to lean through my broken driver's window and open my glove compartment. He didn't steal my wallet, my laptop, or my spare cash. Instead, he had taken my personal travel journal, the one where I had written down my full home address in North Carolina, my workplace schedule, my personal cell number, and the exact dates of every camping trip I had planned for the rest of the autumn season. 2 days later, the Sevier County Sheriff's Office released his full identity after cross-referencing fingerprints recovered from the passenger door handle and my broken window frame. His name was Russell Gabe Miller, a former seasonal maintenance worker fired from a state park in Georgia 6 months prior, following accusations of covert surveillance on park guests. When state troopers raided the abandoned pickup truck he had been living in near the park boundary, they uncovered a massive haul of evidence. Inside the truck's bed were 3 plastic storage bins containing 27 stolen driver's licenses, personal notebooks filled with transcribed guest ledger data from 9 different state and national parks, and a collection of spare vehicle keys. Russell wasn't an opportunistic local drifter. He was a nomadic predator who moved from campground to campground across 4 southern states, specifically hunting for the single occupant code logged on public, unattended entrance kiosks. Because he knew the administrative procedures of park systems inside and out, he could imitate park staff with chilling precision, using the illusion of authority to make solo female campers drop their guard and open their doors. I terminated my van rental, drove back to North Carolina in my personal car under police escort, and spent the next 6 months completely restructuring my life. I installed a high-tech smart security system at my house. I stopped taking solo trips. I stopped filling out paper forms at unmonitored entry kiosks, demanding digital or private check-ins whenever I traveled. I spent months in trauma therapy, trying to unlearn the instinct to panic whenever a heavy footstep crunched on gravel outside my bedroom window. Eventually, the nightmare faded into the background. I convinced myself that with his mugshot broadcast across national news outlets and a federal warrant out for his arrest, Russell Miller would never risk coming near me again. I thought the paper trail had ended on that rainy night in the Smoky Mountains. Until 3 weeks ago, I was sitting in my kitchen on a bright, sunny Sunday afternoon, making coffee. My mailbox sat at the end of my suburban driveway, 20 feet from my front porch. I walked out to collect the afternoon mail. Among the usual utility bills and grocery store circulars was a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a small town 3 hours away. Inside was a single piece of paper, a yellow carbon copy receipt from a state park check-in binder. My name, my current home address, and my car's new license plate number were filled out in neat blue ballpoint ink. And at the bottom of the slip, inside the box labeled number of occupants, someone had crossed out the number 1 with a thick red marker and written a single word next to it. D. I dropped the paper onto the hot asphalt of my driveway, staring at the empty, quiet street stretching out before me under the bright afternoon sun. Russell Miller hasn't been caught. The police still don't know where he is hiding. And every time I hear a door knock after dark, no matter how official, no matter how polite, I know I will never open it again. The campground host knocked on our RV door for a routine site inspection at 11 p.m. Real park staff don't do inspections after dark. I found that out the hard way. When you rent a camper van for a solo trip into the mountains, you make a conscious trade-off. You trade the comforting deadbolts of a city apartment for thin aluminum walls, glass sliding windows, and the illusion that a managed campground is a safe harbor. You tell yourself that because there's a timber archway at the entrance, a gravel loop road, and families roasting marshmallows 50 yards away. Nothing bad can touch you behind those wooden boundaries. My name is Elena. I'm 24 years old, an environmental analyst from North Carolina. It was the Friday evening of Labor Day weekend, and I had rented a compact, 18-foot Class B camper van, a converted Ford Transit, to spend 4 days hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. The campground I booked was Pinecrest, a sprawling, well-maintained park nestled deep inside a dense forest of eastern hemlocks and tall pines. It wasn't primitive backcountry wilderness. It had paved loop roads, streetlights near the central bathhouses, and a gated entrance kiosk. Site 42 sat on the outer ring of Loop B, backing up into a steep, pitch-black mountain ridge. I had arrived around 6:30 p.m., while the sky was still painted in bruised shades of purple and orange. The main entrance gate was unstaffed when I pulled in. A weather-damaged wooden kiosk stood beside the wooden gate arm, housing a large metal clipboard with a public check-in binder. A laminated sign read, "After hours, check-in. Please write your name, site number, vehicle license plate, and number of occupants in the ledger binder below. Display your carbon receipt on your driver dashboard." I stepped out of the van into the cool mountain air, pulled the heavy clip pen from its chain, and filled out the paper form. Elena Vance, Site 42. Vehicle, Silver Ford Transit, NC license plate, bar JKL 88821. Occupants, 1. As I slid the yellow carbon copy under my windshield wiper, I noticed a man standing near the wooden display board 10 feet away. He was dressed in dark jeans, heavy work boots, and a faded navy blue windbreaker with a circular pine tree patch sewn onto the left chest. He held a silver flashlight and a clipboard, looking intently at the trail maps posted on the timber wall. He looked completely official, like a seasonal park ranger or a volunteer campground host winding down his evening shift. When my sneakers crunched on the gravel, he turned his head and gave me a polite, neighborly nod. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with short brown hair, a stubble-covered jaw, and a quiet, unassuming posture. "Evening," he said in a calm, flat southern accent. "Heading up to Loop B?" "Yeah, Site 42, I replied, offering a polite smile as I stepped back into the driver's seat. "Just making sure I got the check-in paper right." "You're all set," he said, tapping his clipboard with his pen. "Site 42 is quiet tonight. Backs right up to the creek ridge. Have a good evening, ma'am." "Thanks, you too," I said, putting the van in drive and rolling slowly up the gravel loop road. That was it. A totally normal, completely unmemorable interaction between a camper and a staff member. I found Site 42, backed the silver van onto the gravel pad, connected the power cable to the campsite pedestal, and pulled the thick privacy shades closed over the side and rear windows. By 10 p.m., the campground had settled into a deep, quiet rhythm. The heavy summer rain had stopped an hour prior, leaving the pine needles dripping and the air thick with damp earth. The distant laughter from neighboring campfires had died down, replaced by the roaring hum of the creek behind my sight and the steady chirping of mountain crickets. I sat on the bench seat inside the warm, wood-paneled interior of the van, wearing my gray fleece hoodie and wool socks, reading a paperback book on my phone. At 10:45 p.m., a faint sound rattled the front of the van. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, metallic scrape against the front driver's side bumper, followed by the quiet thud of something resting against the windshield glass. I paused my reading, holding my breath. "Probably a falling branch," I muttered to myself. I leaned forward, peeling back the edge of the front cab's privacy curtain to look out through the windshield. Positioned right in the middle of the glass, tucked beneath the driver's side windshield wiper blade, was a folded white piece of paper. It hadn't been there when I parked. I reached for my keys, unlocked the driver's side door, cracked it open 3 inches, and pulled the paper inside. Unfolding it under the warm LED ceiling light of the camper van, I saw a handwritten note scribbled in thick blue ballpoint ink. "Notice of registration discrepancy. Vehicle number JKL 8821. Unregistered secondary vehicle reported on Site 42. Please present registration documents to campground management before 11 p.m. to avoid towing." My stomach gave a small, uneasy churn. Secondary vehicle? I didn't have a secondary vehicle. I was alone in a single converted van. I looked at my phone screen. The time read 10:52 p.m. Before I could even process who had tucked that paper under my wiper blade in the dark, a heavy, loud hand slammed against the sliding side door of my van. Bang, 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 making the entire aluminum frame shake on its tires. The entire aluminum. I flinched as the heavy impact echoed through the thin metal siding of the camper van. My heart instantly climbed into my throat. The entire 18-foot vehicle swayed slightly on its suspension and dropped the piece of paper onto the kitchen counter, my hand instinctively flying to the heavy sliding door deadbolt to ensure it was thrown tight into its socket. "Site 42!" a voice called out from the darkness outside. A loud, authoritative voice projected directly against the metal door. "Campground management, I need you to open up for a quick site registration audit." I stood dead still in the middle of the narrow aisle, my wool socks planted firm against the vinyl floor. I reached up and gently nudged the small, tinted 6 by 8 inch glass slider window on the side door open just half an inch, keeping the thick fabric privacy shade pulled down so he couldn't see my face or the interior layout of the van. "Hello?" I called out, keeping my tone as firm and composed as I could manage. "It's almost 11 o'clock at night. What's going on?" "Park management, ma'am," the voice answered promptly. Through the narrow half-inch gap in the glass slider, I could hear the wet crunch of gravel under his heavy work boots. A bright white flashlight beam suddenly snapped on, sweeping across the side of my van before tilting down toward the gravel ground. "We have an automated discrepancy in our entry ledger for Loop B," he continued, his tone smooth, measured, and official. "Your license plate, North Carolina JKL 8821, was flagged at the gate kiosk as having an unregistered second vehicle parked on the pad, or a discrepancy in your occupant count. I need you to slide open the door so I can verify your physical registration receipt and check your driver's license." I pressed my back against the plywood partition behind the driver's seat. "I don't have a second vehicle," I said loudly through the screen gap. "I'm the only one here. I filled out the yellow paper slip at the front gate 2 hours ago and put the carbon receipt on my dashboard, just like the sign said." "I understand that, ma'am," he replied without missing a beat. His tone was perfectly polite, the tune of a tired government worker just trying to finish a tedious late-night shift. "Problem is, the carbon copy on your dash isn't legible from out here through the tint. Company policy requires a visual match of the occupant's ID against the master book before midnight. I've got 3 other sites to check on Loop B tonight. If you could just step out or slide the main door back for 10 seconds, we can get this cleared up so you can get back to sleep." I hesitated. Every instinct ingrained in me as a polite citizen whispered that I should just slide the door back, show my license, and end the awkward interaction. He sounded official. He used park terminology like master book and entry ledger. He knew my exact license plate number. He even knew where the carbon receipt was supposed to be displayed. "He's just doing his job," a voice in my head rationalized. "Don't be the paranoid camper who makes a scene over a 5-second administrative check." I reached my hand toward the heavy brass door handle. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal latch. Then, my eyes drifted down to the kitchen counter, where I had tossed the handwritten note 2 minutes ago. Under the bright overhead LED lights of the van, I looked closely at the blue ballpoint ink. The note said, "Notice of registration discrepancy, vehicle number JKL 8821. My mind raced back to the check-in kiosk at 6:30 p.m. When I wrote my license plate number on the paper ledger in the wooden kiosk, my pen had slipped slightly on the damp paper. I had written the number 8821, but the ink on the paper looked slightly smeared, almost like an 8827. Yet, the handwritten note placed under my windshield blade, and the man standing outside my door right now, both pronounced the digits perfectly, 8821. He hadn't read the smeared yellow paper slip sitting on my dashboard through the tinted glass. He had read my physical metal license plate mounted on the back bumper of the van 5 minutes ago. A sudden, sharp spike of ice shot through my chest. I pulled my hand away from the door latch as if the metal had suddenly turned red hot. "Can you just read the name on your clipboard to me?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, tightening with newfound caution. "If you have the master ledger, read me the name assigned to Site 42. Silence settled over the gravel pad outside. The roaring hum of the mountain creek 50 yards away seemed to grow louder, filling the quiet night air. The heavy rain droplets falling from the hemlock branches onto the aluminum roof sounded like slow, rhythmic tapping fingers. 5 seconds passed, then 10. "Ma'am, I don't have time to play guessing games at 11 p.m., he said. His voice was still calm, but the polite, administrative warmth had completely evaporated. It was cold now, hard. "I am an authorized park representative inspecting a registered campsite. Refusing to cooperate with a site audit is a violation of park rules and can result in immediate eviction from the grounds." "I'm not opening the door," I said firmly, stepping back into the center of the cabin. "If there's an administrative issue, I'll walk down to the main entrance kiosk in the morning and sort it out with the office." "The front office closes at 8 p.m., he shot back instantly. "There won't be anyone there until 9 a.m. tomorrow. Step out of the van, Elena." My blood ran completely cold. My jaw dropped. I stared at the dark fabric curtain covering the slider window. I hadn't given him my name. The passenger door flew open into the dark, wet woods, slamming against its rubber stop with a loud crack. Behind me, the sound of heavy metal shattering safety glass exploded through the front cab. Shatter! The tire iron drove straight through the driver's side window, raining hundreds of tiny, razor-sharp tempered glass cubes across the dashboard and driver's seat where I had been sitting 2 seconds prior. I tumbled out of the passenger side, landing hard on my hands and knees in the cold, muddy gravel. Pain shot up my palms as sharp stones bit into my skin. But adrenaline instantly flooded my system, drowning out the pain. "Get back here!" he roared from inside the front cab. I was scrambling over the center console from the driver's seat, his heavy boots crushing glass as he tried to claw his way out through the open passenger door after me. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my heavy steel thermos like a weapon, and sprinted blindly down the paved loop road toward the center of Loop B. The storm was unrelenting. Heavy rain whipped across my face, blinding my eyes, as my wool socks slipped inside my wet sneakers against the slick asphalt. The campground was pitch black except for the distant amber glow of the streetlight mounted on the brick wall of the main bathhouse, 70 yards ahead. Behind me, the heavy rhythmic squelch crunch of his work boots hit the pavement. He was running fast, cutting through the pine needles between campsites to cut off my angle. "Help!" I shrieked, my voice raw and rasping against the freezing air. "Fire! Call 911! Help me!" I shouted fire, because I remembered a self-defense instructor once saying that people in suburban or wilderness settings respond faster to fire alarms than screams for help. To my left, a light snapped on inside an Airstream trailer at Site 38. A silhouette appeared behind a small glass window, pulling back a curtain to look out into the rain. "Call the sheriff! He has a weapon!" I screamed toward the trailer, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down to explain. If I stopped running, he would tackle me before anyone could unlock their door. I reached the lit perimeter of the main bathhouse. The brick building smelled of damp concrete and chlorine. Mounted on the exterior cinder block wall directly beneath a bright yellow insect bulb was a heavy, weatherproof metal box painted bright red. "Emergency phone, direct to county sheriff." I threw myself against the brick wall, grabbed the heavy chrome latch of the red box, and yanked it downward. The door popped open, revealing a heavy black telephone handset resting on a cradle. No keypad, no buttons. The moment the handset was lifted from its cradle, a mechanical relay switch tripped, sending an automatic landline distress signal directly to the county emergency dispatch network. I ripped the handset off the cradle and pressed it to my ear. "Ring, ring. County emergency dispatch, state your location." A clear, synthesized female voice barked through the receiver speaker. "Pinecrest Campground, Loop B," I gasped, leaning my back against the cold cinder block wall, my lungs burning like fire. "Site 42. A man is attacking me with a tire iron. He's pursuing me. Ma'am, stay on the line. Landline signal confirmed at Pinecrest Loop B bathhouse. Units are en route." A dark shadow dropped off the grassy embankment 5 feet away. Russell sprang out from the hemlock trees like a predator executing an ambush. His navy windbreaker was soaked dark, his face smeared with black mud, and his eyes wild and bloodshot under the harsh yellow bulb. In his right hand, he held the heavy iron tire bar. Before I could dodge, he lunged forward, grabbing the coil cord of the landline handset with his left hand and yanking it violently downward, ripping the thick copper wire clean out of the wall box with a shower of tiny sparks. "You rind it," he panted, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and cold rain, his body towering over me against the cinder block wall. "You were supposed to just open the door like a good girl." He raised the tire iron high, aiming for the side of my head. I didn't try to block it with my arms. Instead, with every remaining ounce of adrenaline in my body, I swung my heavy steel thermos upward in a savage diagonal strike, driving the heavy stainless steel base directly into the bridge of his nose. Crack! Russell let out a sharp, guttural roar of agony as blood erupted from his nostrils. He stumbled backward 3 steps, clutching his broken face, his grip slipping off the tire iron as it crashed onto the concrete floor. "Get away from me!" I screamed, using the momentum to kick him square in the chest with my muddy hiking boot. He fell backward into the wet grass, cursing wildly. At that exact moment, the high-pitched, wailing scream of a police siren began echoing through the mountain pass from the main highway below. Red and blue strobe lights swept across the distant pine trees at the campground's main entrance archway. A loud, booming voice echoed from a megaphone near the front gate. "This is the Sevier County Sheriff's Office. All campers stay in your vehicles." Russell looked toward the main gate, then down at his blood-stained hands. He knew the landline call box had given emergency dispatch his exact GPS coordinates. I didn't try to strike again. He scrambled to his feet, turned toward the dark mountain ridge behind the bathhouse, and vanished into the impenetrable wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains. I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor of the bathhouse porch, shivering violently, holding the steel thermos against my chest as two armed deputies came sprinting up the paved road of Loop B. I stood frozen in the middle of the narrow aisle, the air leaving my lungs in a cold, painful hitch. Elena. He had spoken my first name with absolute terrifying familiarity. Not as a guess, not as a formal title, but like someone who had been reading my personal information over and over until it was burned into his memory. I had never spoken my name aloud to him. I hadn't worn a name tag. The only place my name existed within 50 miles of this mountain ridge was on that public paper check-in binder, resting in the unattended wooden kiosk at the campground entrance. He hadn't just glanced at the map board while I checked in at 6:30 p.m. He had stood 10 feet away, watching my hands move across the clipboard, waiting for me to drive up into Loop B so he could flip the binder open, read my name, write down my license plate, and note that I was a 24-year-old woman registered entirely alone. "Elena," he called out again, his voice dropping another octave. He stepped closer to the side door. I could hear the wet canvas of his windbreaker rubbing against the aluminum van wall as he leaned his body directly against the vehicle frame. "Save us both the headache. Just open the door." My heart pounded so violently against my ribs, I was terrified he could hear it through the metal paneling. I scrambled quietly into the front cab of the van, ducking below the height of the dashboard so my silhouette wouldn't register against the glass. I grabbed my phone off the passenger seat and swiped open the screen. In the top right corner, the cellular signal indicator showed a single, flickering gray bar. And then, as if mocking me, it shifted to a slash icon. No service. Deep inside the mountain notch of Loop B, the thick canopy of hemlocks and heavy rain clouds had completely choked out the local cell tower connection. I couldn't call 911. I couldn't send a text message. I was sealed inside an 18-foot metal box on an isolated gravel pad, 20 yards away from the nearest occupied RV site, surrounded by pitch-black mountain woods. I remembered the official yellow paper brochure the landlord of the camper van rental agency had stuffed into the glove compartment. I opened the plastic box with trembling fingers, pulled out the paper, and held it under the dim light of my phone screen. Printed in bold black text at the bottom of the rules section was a single line: "Emergency park contact. For after-hours assistance or security emergencies, please use the yellow emergency call box located on the exterior wall of the main bathhouse, Loop B, connected directly to the county sheriff's landline." The main bathhouse. I knew where it was. It sat in the middle of Loop B, roughly 70 yards down the paved incline road from my site. A brick building lit by a single amber streetlight. If I stayed inside the van, I was trapped. The deadbolt on the sliding door was sturdy, but the van's side windows were simple glass panes. If he realized I wasn't going to fall for his authority routine, he could break the glass in 2 seconds, reach inside, and unlock the latch himself. Outside, the silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, the flashlight beam, illuminating the gravel ground, vanished. Click! He turned his flashlight off. The complete absence of light outside made the windows pitch black. I couldn't see where he was. The steady drum roll of raindrops falling onto the camper van roof hid the sound of his footsteps on the wet pine needles. "Elena?" his voice echoed, this time from the back of the van. He had moved around to the rear bumper without making a sound. Squeak! A sharp metallic tension sound vibrated through the rear doors. He was grasping the heavy exterior spare tire mount on the back, pulling himself up onto the rear bumper, putting his full body weight against the rear door handle to see if the upper latch had been thrown shut. The van rocked backward on its rear tires. "Creak, creak. I know you're in there alone, Elena," he whispered. His voice pressed right against the thin rubber seal of the back door. The cold, flat tone in his voice made my stomach drop into a bottomless void. "I saw the single sleeping bag on the rear bench when you pulled into the loop. There's nobody coming to help you." I didn't wait. I didn't think. I grabbed my heavy steel thermos off the kitchen counter, holding it like a club in my right hand. With my left hand, I slammed my palm down onto the center of the steering wheel. Honk! 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 The van's horn blared out across the quiet campground, a loud, piercing, rhythmic alarm echoing off the mountain trees, shattering the stillness of Loop B. "Help!" I shrieked at the top of my lungs, pounding my fists against the driver's side window. "Someone help me! Call the police!" Outside, A heavy thud echoed as he jumped off the rear bumper onto the gravel pad. "Shut up!" he snarled, his voice losing every trace of its calm composure. Through the front windshield, I saw a dark, heavy shadow rush around the side of the vehicle. He grabbed the driver's side exterior door handle and yanked it upward with ferocious force. Clack, 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 trying to rip the locked door open. When the latch held, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy metal tire iron. He raised it high above his shoulder, aiming the heavy steel tip directly at the glass of my driver's side window. In that fraction of a second, I knew if that glass shattered, I was dead. I threw myself across the passenger seat, reached for the passenger door handle, threw the manual lock lever open, and shoved the door outward into the pouring rain with all the strength in my legs. I found a small chalk mark on the corner of my tent the second morning, a symbol I didn't recognize. My campsite neighbor's tent had one too. Hers said something different. It was the second week of July, and Lake Tahoe was doing what it always does in the summer. Packed campgrounds, the smell of campfire smoke drifting between sites, kids on bikes weaving around minivans backing into gravel parking spurs. I was 22 years old, 2 weeks out from starting my first real job as a physical therapy assistant in Sacramento. And I'd promised myself one last solo trip before my schedule disappeared into a 9-to-5 for the foreseeable future. My name is Sydney Park. I'd grown up camping, Boy Scout dad, family trips every summer since I could walk. And by college I was the friend everyone called before a backpacking trip because I actually knew how to read a topo map and pitch a tent in a windstorm without losing my patience. Solo camping wasn't new to me. I'd done it twice before, both times in quieter, more remote spots where the solitude was the entire point. This trip was supposed to be different. Not solitude, just a reservation I didn't want to waste. My two closest friends, Maddie and Priya, had booked Site 114 with me 3 months out, back when a July weekend at Tahoe felt impossibly far away. 48 hours before we were supposed to leave, Maddie came down with a stomach bug, and Priya's manager scheduled her for an emergency inventory shift neither of us could talk her out of. The site was non-refundable, already paid for, and something stubborn in me refused to let $300 go to waste over a change of plans. "It's Tahoe in July," I told my mom over the phone, only half convincing myself along with her. "There's going to be like 400 people in that campground. I'm not going to be alone out there." She wasn't thrilled, but she also knew better than to argue with me once I'd made up my mind about something. I packed my 4-person tent, overkill for one person, but it was the only one I owned, loaded up my Subaru, and made the 3-hour drive up from Sacramento on a bright, cloudless Friday morning. The campground was exactly as crowded as I'd promised her it would be. Site after site packed with families, retirees in fifth wheels, groups of college kids with cases of beer stacked by their coolers. I pulled into Site 114 around noon, wedged between a family of 5 on one side and on the other, a woman about my age setting up a small 2-person tent by herself. "Solo too?" she called over, wiping sweat from her forehead as she wrestled a tent pole into place. "Yeah," I said, dragging my own gear out of the trunk. Friends bailed at the last second. "Story of my life," she laughed, extending a hand. "Kayla, Site 113. We spent a companionable hour, setting up side by side, the easy camaraderie of strangers who'd both ended up somewhere alone through no real fault of their own. By the time my tent was pitched, my cooler was tucked into the shade, and my camp chair was set up facing the lake, glinting through the trees. The whole trip felt exactly like what I'd hoped for. Quiet, self-sufficient, pleasantly uneventful. The first night passed without incident. I cooked dinner over my little camp stove, read a few chapters of A Paperback by Headlamp, and fell asleep to the distant sound of someone's guitar a few sites over. The kind of gentle background noise that makes a crowded campground feel almost cozy rather than chaotic. It was the second morning, stepping out to refill my water bottle at the spigot near the loop road, that I noticed it. A small mark on the bottom corner of my tent's rainfly. Chalk, pale against the dark green fabric, roughly the size of a quarter. 2 intersecting lines with a small circle at the base, drawn with the kind of quick, practiced confidence that suggested it hadn't taken the person more than a second or two to make. I crouched down, running my thumb lightly over it. Definitely chalk. Definitely not something that had been there when I set up the tent. I'd have noticed smudging that corner while staking it down. My first thought was almost embarrassingly mundane. Kids. There were plenty of them running around the loop on bikes and scooters. The kind of unsupervised summer freedom that comes with a packed family campground. Probably some 7-year-old had wandered past with a piece of sidewalk chalk and marked a few tents for fun. The way kids leave chalk hopscotch grids on driveways without a second thought. I almost let it go entirely. Almost. But something about the precision of it nagged at me as I stood there. The mark wasn't sloppy or random the way a kid's doodle usually is. It was clean, deliberate. 2 lines and a circle drawn in exactly the same spot on the tent that anyone walking past on the loop road would have easy, unobstructed access to, low enough that you wouldn't need to lean over anything to reach it. I glanced over at Kayla's site, half out of curiosity, half just to have something to mention to someone over morning coffee. Her tent had a mark too, different from mine. Not the 2 lines and circle, but something that looked almost like a small triangle with a dot inside it, chalked onto the corner of her tent in the same pale white, the same unhurried, confident stroke. "Hey!" I called over, crouching by my water jug, but keeping my eyes on her site. Random question. Did you draw anything on your tent? Like a symbol or something? Kayla looked up from her camp stove, confused. No? Why? I walked the short distance between our sites and pointed. She followed my finger, her expression shifting from confusion to something more uncertain as she crouched down to examine it herself. "That's definitely not mine," she said slowly. I didn't even notice that was there. We stood there for a moment, both staring at 2 different chalk symbols on 2 different tents belonging to 2 women, camping completely alone, and neither of us said what I think we were both starting to think, that whatever this was, it hadn't happened by accident, and it definitely hadn't happened just once. I didn't tell Kayla my plan directly. I think some part of me still didn't want to say out loud that I intended to sit awake in the dark, watching for a stranger on what was supposed to be a relaxing solo weekend. But when I saw her light still on in her tent well past 11, I understood without asking that she was doing the exact same thing 3 sites over. I'd unzipped the small mesh window on the side of my tent facing the loop road, angled just enough that I could see a slice of the gravel path without exposing much of myself to anyone looking back. My phone sat in my lap, camera app already open, brightness turned all the way down so the screen glow wouldn't give me away. Every ordinary night sound, the settling creak of someone's camp chair, the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the pines, the soft crunch of gravel under someone's late walk to the bathhouse, sent my pulse spiking before I could remind myself that most of what moved through a campground at night was completely mundane. Around 1 a.m., the loop finally went properly quiet. String lights clicked off one by one. The last stray voices near the fire pits faded into silence. Even the crickets seemed to settle into a steadier, more monotonous rhythm. The kind of white noise that usually meant a campground had fully gone to sleep. That was when I saw him. A figure moving slowly along the loop road, unhurried in a way that immediately separated him from anyone simply walking to the bathroom or back to their site. He wore a dark jacket now, instead of the plaid shirt I'd noticed earlier. But something about his build, his gait, matched the man I'd clocked near the firewood pile that afternoon. I wasn't using a flashlight. He moved with the confidence of someone who either knew this campground intimately or had walked this exact loop enough times recently to navigate it comfortably in the dark. I held my breath. Phone raised just slightly. Camera pointed through the mesh gap, recording without daring to check the screen for fear the faint light would give me away. He stopped first at the tent belonging to the woman who'd checked in that afternoon, the one Kayla had found marked within an hour of her arrival. He crouched low near the corner of her tent, motionless for a handful of seconds, his head tilted slightly as if listening for movement inside. Then he stood, unhurried, and continued down the loop. He passed 2 sites with no mark, the retired couple, a family tent, without so much as slowing his pace. Then he reached Kayla's site. He crouched there longer than he had at the first tent, nearly 10 full seconds by my count, his stillness somehow more unsettling than any sudden movement could have been. I could see, even in the dim ambient light, something small and pale clutched in his hand, a short stick of chalk, worn down at one end from repeated use. My chest tightened as he moved on toward mine. I forced myself to keep the phone steady, resisting every instinct screaming at me to duck away from the mesh window, to make myself small and invisible inside my own tent. He crouched at the corner of my rainfly, close enough now that I could make out the shape of his face in the faint moonlight. Unremarkable, forgettable. Exactly the kind of face that could blend into any crowd of campers without drawing a second glance. I wasn't adding a new mark. He was looking at the existing one, studying it the way you'd check a label you'd already written, confirming it was still there, still legible, still doing its job. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something else. Not chalk this time, but a small notebook, flipping it open with practiced efficiency and jotting something down in the dark before tucking it away again. I understood, with a sick lurch in my stomach, exactly what I was watching. This wasn't random vandalism. This was inventory. He wasn't just marking tents. He was tracking them, checking back on marks he'd already made, recording something about each one in that notebook before moving to the next. He straightened up and continued down the loop, pausing at 2 more tents, both, as far as I could tell, in the dark, belonging to women I hadn't yet spoken to, before disappearing around the bend toward the far end of the campground, back toward the maintenance road that bordered the tree line. I sat frozen for a long moment after he vanished from sight, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone when I finally lowered it. I had it. I had him on camera, crouched at 3 separate tents, chalk in hand, notebook out. But I also had a colder, more specific understanding, settling over the adrenaline. This wasn't his first night doing this. The existing marks weren't accidents from some earlier moment I'd missed. They were part of an ongoing system, one he was actively maintaining, checking, and updating. And I had just watched him confirm that my tent was still exactly where he'd left it. I texted Kayla immediately, my thumbs clumsy with adrenaline. He just left my sight. Did you see him at yours? Her reply came back within seconds. Yes, I got it on video too. I think we need to go to the ranger station right now, not wait till morning. She was right, and some steady, practical part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through plenty of unpredictable trail conditions over the years, knew exactly what came next. We weren't going to wait for daylight. We weren't going to talk ourselves out of this being real one more time. We were going to wake up the ranger on duty right now and show them exactly what we'd just watched happen to 5 women's tents in a campground that was supposed to be safe simply because it was crowded. We moved fast once the decision was made. No more hesitating, no more talking ourselves into waiting until morning. I pulled on my boots without bothering to lace them properly, grabbed my phone and the small battery pack I'd need to keep it charged, and met Kayla at the edge of our shared stretch of loop road. Her hands were shaking as badly as mine, but her voice was steady when she spoke. The ranger station's a 10-minute walk. I don't want to go alone, and I don't want you going alone either. We stuck close to the lit sections of the loop road, avoiding the darker gaps between streetlights, both of us glancing over our shoulders more than either of us wanted to admit. The ranger station sat near the campground entrance, a small log building with a single window lit from inside. A battered truck parked out front with the County Park Service logo stenciled on the door. A young ranger, mid-20s, clearly pulled from a nap by our knocking, his uniform jacket half-buttoned, opened the door looking more confused than alarmed, at least until we showed him the footage. His expression changed fast. "Show me that again," he said, taking my phone carefully, his thumb hovering over the screen as he replayed the 10-second clip of the man crouched at Kayla's tent, chalk visible in his hand. "And you're saying this is the same guy who marked—" "How many tents, exactly?" "At least 5 that we found today," I said. "All of them belong to women camping alone. The family and group tents have different marks or no marks at all." The ranger, his name badge read J. Alvarez, pulled out a radio and made a low, urgent call to what I assumed was campground security dispatch, relaying our description of the man's jacket, his build, the direction he'd headed after finishing his rounds. Then he turned back to us, his expression grave in a way that told me this wasn't the first time he'd heard something like this, even if it was the first time he'd seen actual footage of it happening. "I need you both to come inside and walk me through everything, start to finish," he said. "And I need to be honest with you. We've had a couple of vague complaints from other campgrounds in the district this summer. Nothing this specific, nothing on video. If what you're describing is what I think it is, this isn't new. This has been happening somewhere in this park system for a while. Kayla and I sat in the small station, adrenaline slowly curdling into exhaustion, while Alvarez pulled up a district-wide incident log on an aging desktop computer, scrolling through entries that stretched back weeks. A reported theft at a campground 40 miles north, a woman's uneasy account of someone watching her tent at a different lake 2 counties over. Nothing conclusive on its own, but forming, when laid side by side with what we'd just shown him, the unmistakable shape of a pattern nobody had connected until tonight. "We're going to need actual law enforcement on this, not just park staff," Alvarez said, already reaching for his radio again. "County Sheriff's Office has a substation 20 minutes out. I'm calling them now, and I want you both to stay here until they arrive. I don't want either of you walking back to your sites alone tonight." The next hour blurred into a haze of statements, footage transfers, and increasingly serious expressions from the 2 sheriff's deputies who arrived just before 3 a.m. They set up quietly near the edge of our loop, positioned to watch without being seen, using our description of the man's route and timing to anticipate exactly where and when he might reappear. He came back around 4:15 a.m. I wasn't there to see it happen. Alvarez had insisted Kayla and I wait inside the ranger station, out of harm's way. But the deputy who briefed us afterward described a man crouched at the edge of a brand new tent, one that had checked into the campground only that evening. Chalk already halfway through drawing the now familiar 2 lines and circle symbol when the deputies closed in. I didn't run. He didn't fight. According to the deputy, he simply straightened up, chalk still in hand, and said something that would stay with me long after that weekend ended. I wasn't going to hurt anyone tonight. I was just looking. When they searched him, they found the notebook I'd seen him consulting near my tent. Dozens of pages filled with site numbers, dates, small sketched symbols matching what we'd found chalked onto tents across the loop, and notes in the cramped, careful hand. Solo, no dog, quiet by 10. Solo, small dog, light sleeper. Solo, phone light visible late. Entries stretching back, the deputy told us grimly. At least 6 weeks, and not just from this campground. We told ourselves it was probably nothing, for exactly as long as it took to walk the loop road together and start actually looking. "It's probably some marking system for the maintenance crew," Kayla offered, though her voice carried the particular flatness of someone talking herself into an explanation rather than believing one. "Like site inspections or something. Recycling pickup days. Something boring like that." It was a reasonable theory. Campgrounds did run maintenance schedules. Mark sites for firewood delivery, flag spots that needed septic service. I wanted to believe it too. But as we walked, coffee mugs forgotten back at our respective camp stoves, the pattern that emerged made that explanation feel thinner with every site we passed. The family 5 sites down from mine. 2 adults, 3 kids, an enormous canopy tent, and 2 smaller ones. Had a mark too, but it was nothing like ours. A simple straight line with 2 short marks crossing it, almost like a small ladder, chalked onto the leg of their picnic table rather than the tent itself. The retired couple near the bathhouse had no mark at all. The group of 4 college guys sharing 2 tents near the entrance to our loop, no mark. But 3 sites further down, another young woman traveling with what looked like just a small dog and a single-person tent had the exact same 2 lines and circle symbol as mine, chalked onto the same low corner of her rainfly. By the time we'd circled half the loop, we'd counted 5 tents with the 2 lines and circle mark, every single one belonging, as far as we could tell from a quick, casual conversation with each occupant, to a woman camping alone. The family and group tents that had markings at all carried a completely different symbol, and plenty of tents, the ones with couples, the ones with obvious multiple occupants, had no chalk on them whatsoever. "Okay," Kayla said quietly, once we'd circled back to our own sites. "That's not a maintenance schedule." I didn't answer right away. I was staring at the mark on my own tent, running through every plausible, boring explanation I could think of, and watching each one collapse under the weight of what we'd just found. A recycling schedule doesn't sort tents by whether a woman is sleeping in them alone. A firewood delivery mark doesn't skip every family site and land exclusively on single female campers. "Maybe we should ask at the ranger station," I said. Though even as I said it, some part of me hesitated. The same part of me that hated calling attention to things that might turn out to be nothing, that worried about looking paranoid over what could still, theoretically, have some explanation neither of us had thought of yet. Instead, we did what I now recognize as the classic mistake of two people trying to rationalize their way out of taking something seriously. We decided to wait and watch just for the rest of the day before making it into a whole thing with campground staff. The afternoon passed in the ordinary rhythm of a Tahoe campground in July. Kids swimming at the lake access point, the smell of someone's barbecue drifting through camp, the low buzz of a dozen different conversations blending into background noise. I hiked a short trail alone in the late afternoon. Told myself the chalk mark was probably some harmless inside joke among campground staff I wasn't understanding, and came back to find Kayla waiting at my site, her expression tighter than it had been that morning. "I found another one," she said without preamble. "On the tent 2 down from mine. Same symbol as ours. That woman just checked in an hour ago. She's here alone too. Her boyfriend dropped her off and left." A cold, prickling unease settled over the easy warmth of the afternoon. It wasn't a one-time occurrence from the night before. It was ongoing, active. Someone had walked this loop again sometime in the last hour, marking a brand new arrival within 60 minutes of her setting up her tent. "Someone's watching who checks in," I said slowly, the words feeling strange and heavy leaving my mouth. Like saying them out loud made the possibility more real than keeping it as an unspoken worry in my head. Not just marking randomly at night, watching who arrives and marking them fast. Kayla didn't argue with me. I think some part of her had already reached the same conclusion and had just been waiting for someone else to say it first. We spent the rest of the evening more alert than either of us wanted to admit, glancing up every time someone walked past on the loop road, cataloging faces without meaning to. The family grilling burgers, the retired couple walking their dog, a lone man in a plaid shirt we'd both noticed earlier that day loading firewood into the bed of a pickup truck near the camp store. Unremarkable in every way, except that I found myself, for reasons I couldn't quite articulate, tracking exactly how long he lingered near our section of the loop before moving on. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridgeline and the campground shifted into its nighttime rhythm, string lights flicking on, the murmur of conversations softening, the occasional distant laugh carrying across the lake. I'd made a decision I hadn't voiced yet even to Kayla. I wasn't going to sleep tonight. Not really. I was going to watch the loop road from inside my tent, phone camera ready, and see for myself whether whoever had marked 5 tents full of women sleeping alone was planning on coming back to finish the job on the rest of us. The sun was fully up by the time the deputies finished taking our statements, the campground slowly waking around us into an ordinary Saturday morning. The smell of bacon drifting from someone's site. Kids already splashing at the lake access point, utterly unaware of what had unfolded along the loop road while they slept. It was strange, sitting in a camp chair outside the ranger station with a paper cup of bad coffee, watching that normalcy resume as if nothing had happened at all. The deputy who'd led the arrest, a woman named Sergeant Ruiz, came to find us before we packed up, her expression carrying the particular weariness of someone who'd spent the last few hours confirming something worse than what she'd walked in expecting. "His name is Walter Greer," she said. 58, no prior record we could find under that name, which tells us he's either been very careful or he's been operating under different aliases. We're cross-referencing the notebook entries against incident reports from 3 other counties right now. Based on what he's already told us, this wasn't his first summer doing this. "What was he actually planning to do?" Kayla asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it all weekend. "With the marks, I mean. What was the end game?" Ruiz hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. "He's claiming it started as theft, targeting sites he judged as easy, low risk. Solo campers, less likely to have someone watching their belongings at all times. But some of what's in that notebook goes beyond property. We're treating this as an active investigation, and I'd rather not speculate further than that with you both right now." She didn't need to speculate further. The careful blankness in her voice told me everything the official caution wouldn't let her say directly. I packed up my tent that morning with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking, brushing the chalk mark off my rainfly with my thumb before folding it away, watching the pale dust scatter into the dirt like it had never meant anything at all. Kayla and I exchanged numbers before we left, promising to check in. The kind of bond that forms fast and permanently between people who've been through something together that neither of them will ever be able to fully explain to someone who wasn't there. I didn't camp again for the rest of that summer. It wasn't a conscious decision so much as a low, persistent resistance. Every time the idea crossed my mind, a flicker of the loop road at 1 a.m., a slow-moving figure with chalk in hand, crouched and patient and utterly unremarkable in the daylight. When I finally did go camping again, the following spring, it was with a group of 6 friends at a site chosen specifically for how close it sat to the ranger station. I found myself, on the first night, walking the perimeter of our own site before bed, running my fingers along every corner of every tent, checking for something I told myself I wasn't really expecting to find. There was nothing there. Just canvas and dust and the ordinary dark of an ordinary campground. Sergeant Ruiz called me 2 months after that first trip, following up as promised. Walter Greer's notebook, once fully processed, connected him to incident reports across 4 different counties, spanning nearly 3 full summers. Dozens of tents marked, a handful of confirmed thefts, and at least 2 reports of women describing an unsettling encounter with a man matching his description that had never, until now, been connected to anything larger than an isolated bad night. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since that morning at the ranger station. Do you know how many of us there actually were? Over the years, I mean. How many tents? There was a pause on the line, long enough that I understood the answer before she gave it. We don't have an exact number, she said finally. And honestly, Sydney, we probably never will. Most of those marks got rained on or brushed off. Or the campers who found them never thought to mention it to anyone. You and Kayla are the only reason we caught this at all. I still camp. I couldn't quite let it go, not entirely. Some stubborn part of me refuses to let one summer take that away completely. But I've never once pitched a tent again without running my hands slowly along every corner first, checking the fabric for anything that shouldn't be there. Most of the time, there's nothing. But I've never stopped checking. The shattered orange casing of my satellite messenger lay scattered across the jagged rocks below, its delicate circuit board crushed into useless debris. You're going the wrong way, Clara. His raspy voice echoed through the narrow canyon. The sound of my own name on his lips sent a jolt of raw electrical panic straight to my heart. He didn't just know what car I drove or where I was camping. He knew me. I didn't answer. I didn't wait to hear another word. I threw myself to the side, sliding down the treacherous shale bank into the bottom of the dry creek bed. Loose stones rained down around me as I hit the gravel bottom, scrambling onto my feet despite the throbbing ache in my left knee. Behind me, I heard the heavy, deliberate crunch of his work boots stepping off the ledge, descending the shale slope with terrifying speed. I bolted up the gulch, using the high gravel banks as cover. Up ahead, where the dry creek bed narrowed, a massive fallen hemlock tree spanned the ravine, its tangled root ball wedged against a steep wall of granite. Beneath the trunk was a tight, dark cavity covered by dead ferns and thick mountain brush. It wasn't an escape route, but it was cover. I dove under the fallen log, dragging my legs into the damp mud beneath the roots, pulling the dead ferns over my body. I held my hand tightly over my mouth, pressing my chest into the frozen dirt, freezing like a cornered animal. Seconds later, his boots hit the floor of the dry creek bed. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He walked slowly, his gait unhurried, almost casual. Through the tiny gaps in the tangled hemlock roots, I saw his heavy leather work boots step into view less than 10 feet from where I lay hidden. "Clara!" he called out, his tone conversational, flat, and hollow. "You really shouldn't have run up the ridge. I had to walk all the way back down to your car to get the second set of keys." My eyes widened in the dark beneath the roots. Second set of keys? He reached into his brown canvas coat pocket and pulled out a metal ring. He jingled it softly in the quiet air. Attached to the ring was a small, worn leather key fob stamped with a silver mountain emblem. A spare key fob my father had given me 3 years ago, which I kept locked inside a magnetic hide-a-key box snapped beneath the rear frame rail of my Subaru. A box I had never told anyone about. "Your dad was smart putting this under the rear bumper," he murmured, stepping closer to the log. "Though, those magnetic boxes aren't as rust-proof as they claim." Took me 5 minutes to pry it off yesterday while you were down at the river shooting the sunset. A horrific realization, colder than the frozen dirt beneath my cheek, settled into my brain. He hadn't stumbled upon my campsite yesterday. He hadn't just picked a random solo camper in the Bridger Teton forest. I was worried you'd leave before I finished setting up the cameras down at the timber trail, he continued, taking another slow step toward the root ball. That's why I unlatched your crank sensor last night. I needed you stuck here until the light was right. I wasn't trying to assault me in my tent. He wasn't trying to steal my photography equipment. I was a sick, obsessive predator who stalked solo female travelers through public travel blogs and geotagged photography posts. He had tracked my public photo itinerary online for weeks, mapped out my exact route into Wyoming, and waited at the logging road spur to turn my solo excursion into a real-life, desperate struggle for survival. I didn't just want to hurt me. He was recording the entire ordeal. He was driving me down that specific gulch because he had set up motion-triggered trail cameras along the single exit path to document my increasing panic as I realized I was trapped. To him, I wasn't a person. I was content. A surge of white-hot, furious rage suddenly boiled through the paralyzing fear in my veins. The sheer indignity of being turned into a helpless prop in his twisted game broke something inside me. I looked down at my hand. My fingers were wrapped tight around the handle of my heavy steel pocket knife. The 3-inch serrated blade already flipped open in the dark. Beside my hip lay a heavy, jagged piece of granite the size of a brick, washed smooth by years of mountain runoff. His boot stepped directly in front of the root gap, less than 18 inches from my face. "Come on out, Clara," he said softly, leaning his head down toward the dark opening. "Let's go back to your car." I didn't hesitate. I didn't scream. I didn't negotiate. I drove the heavy granite rock straight out from beneath the roots with every ounce of physical strength in my body, slamming it violently into his exposed kneecap. Crack! A wet, sickening crunch echoed through the ravine as his leg buckled sideways at an unnatural angle. Russell let out a sharp, breathless howl of agony, collapsing sideways into the gravel bed. Before he could recover, I scrambled out from under the hemlock roots like a feral animal, lunged over his chest, and drove the serrated steel pocket knife straight into the thick meat of his left shoulder. He screamed, thrashing wildly, his heavy arm striking the side of my face and sending my cap flying into the mud. But the blow lacked force. The shock of his shattered knee and the deep stab wound had broken his composure entirely. I didn't stay to fight. I didn't look at his face. I grabbed his dark canvas jacket, ripped the spare key fob from his blood-stained fingers, and sprinted back down the dry creek bed toward the logging road, my bad knee screaming in pain, leaving him thrashing and cursing in the dirt behind me. I ran through those woods as if the devil himself were breathing down my neck. My left knee throbbed with a dull, sickening ache, and my face stung where his forearm had clipped me. But I didn't slow down. I scrambled up the shale bank, burst through the dense hemlock thicket, and stumbled out onto the gravel turnaround of my campsite. My Subaru stood waiting under the harsh midday sun, its hood still propped open. My hands shook so violently I could barely function. I lunged under the open hood, forced the crank sensor's plastic wiring coupler back together until I heard a faint plastic click and slammed the heavy hood down. I dove into the driver's seat, locked every door, and jammed the spare key fob into the ignition slot. The engine cranked twice, chug-chug, and then roared to life. Tears burst from my eyes as the dashboard lights glowed bright blue and green. I threw the vehicle into reverse, backed down the narrow dirt spur without looking, and slammed the shifter into drive. The tires spun furiously on the loose dirt, kicking up a massive cloud of dust, before grabbing traction on Forest Road 3100. I drove those 5 miles of unpaved logging road like a maniac, swerving around boulders and flying over cattle guards, expecting at any second to see a dark green pickup truck block the road ahead. 20 minutes later, my Subaru burst out of the national forest boundary onto the paved state highway. The moment my tires hit the smooth asphalt, my phone on the passenger seat let out a loud sequence of chimes as cell service restored. I pulled off onto the shoulder and dialed 911. 3 state trooper vehicles and an ambulance met me at a highway gas station 15 miles down the road. I gave them my statement while a paramedic cleaned the cuts on my hands and wrapped my sprained knee. A armed search and rescue unit, accompanied by K9 tracking dogs, moved back into Forest Road 3100 to locate Wade Vance. It took them 4 hours to find him. I was still crawling down the dry creek bed, his left kneecap completely shattered, his shoulder heavily bandaged with a stripped piece of his own canvas jacket. He offered no resistance when state troopers surrounded him at gunpoint. The search warrant executed on his off-grid cabin 2 days later uncovered a horrifyingly methodical operation. Wade Vance was a 42 former diesel mechanic who had lived isolated near the national forest for 6 years. Inside his basement, investigators discovered a room lined with computer monitors, high-powered directional antennas, and an organized filing cabinet containing hard drives categorized by state parks and wilderness areas. I had spent years monitoring public landscape photography blogs, geotagged social media posts, and online hiking forums. He would cross-reference solo travelers' public itineraries, track their vehicles using trail cameras installed near remote logging spur roads, and use his mechanical skills to disable their cars while they were away from camp. I didn't just sabotage vehicles. He filmed their frantic, hopeless attempts to escape. Detectives recovered over 40 gigabytes of footage shot from concealed trail cameras hidden along wilderness exit paths across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. I was charged with federal kidnapping, aggravated assault, stalking, and multiple counts of wiretapping and illegal surveillance. My car was repaired. The case was handed over to federal prosecutors, and I moved to a new state. I sold my Subaru, deleted every social media account I had ever owned, and gave up landscape photography entirely. I took an office job in a windowless suburban corporate park, far away from mountains, pine trees, and dirt roads. I spent 18 months in intensive cognitive behavioral therapy, convincing myself that Wade Vance was safely behind bars for the rest of his natural life. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served. Until 3 weeks ago, I received a registered letter in the mail from the U.S. Attorney's Office handling the evidence disposition for Wade's trial. Because the federal court case had officially concluded following his sentencing, the evidence locker was releasing non-vital property back to victims or shredding duplicate files. Included in the envelope was the official inventory sheet of the physical media recovered from Wade's cabin. I scanned down the printed list of hard drives and memory cards. Near the bottom of page 4, highlighted in yellow, was a note regarding a secondary, encrypted external hard drive that federal forensic analysts had only recently managed to crack open. The note read, Item number 408, External Drive, Archive Reserve. Contains 112 unedited video files recorded between 2021 and 2026. Note for victim, Clara Mercer. Analysis confirms video files were continuously uploaded in real time to a private cloud server via an automated secondary cellular relay hidden inside a fake birdhouse mounted directly above Site 3200. My hands began to tremble as I read the final sentence printed at the bottom of the page. Due to the automated nature of the cloud script, the video archive was accessed and downloaded by 4 unique IP addresses 12 hours after Wade Vance's arrest. I stood alone in my quiet suburban kitchen, staring at the paper in my hands while the afternoon sun streamed through the blinds. Wade Vance is sitting in a maximum security federal prison cell in Colorado. But somewhere out there, 4 people are sitting in front of computer screens, watching the footage of me scrambling through the frozen mud, waiting to see where I go next. I stood on that high granite ledge, petrified. Through the clear mountain air, across half a mile of open space, I could see him plain as day. He didn't jump. He didn't run. He didn't try to duck behind a tree or pretend he was doing something else. He just stood there beside my disabled car, feet planted wide on the gravel, holding those heavy black binoculars pinned to his face. He was tracking my every movement as I stood on the bare rock face against the open sky. I knew I could see him. He wanted me to see him. The psychological weight of it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The open wilderness, the soaring pine trees, the golden aspens, the majestic mountain peaks, instantly transformed from a picturesque escape into a massive, inescapable hunting ground. He owned the ground below me. He owned my car. And he was patiently watching me realize just how helpless I really was. My trembling hand dropped the phone to my side. 1 bar, searching, no service. The fleeting connection was gone. I backed away from the edge of the cliff until the granite boulders blocked his line of sight, my lungs burning, my pulse roaring in my ears like a freight train. "Think, Clara, think!" I choked out, clutching my head in my hands. If I walked back down the trail to my campsite, I was walking directly into his arms. He had my car disabled. He had my satellite messenger, and he was armed with whatever tools he used to tear my Subaru apart. But if I stayed up on this ridge, I had no food, no thermal shelter for the freezing night ahead. and only half a bottle of water. He could simply sit down at my camp, drink my coffee, and wait for hypothermia or dehydration to force me back down. I wasn't trying to rush me. He was playing a waiting game, a game where he held all the resources and I held none. Then I remembered my topographical map, 4 miles east of this ridge, past the timberline and across a steep granite gulch. Forest Road, 30s unhindered, intersected with an older, semi-maintained county access trail that led toward a fire lookout tower and a seasonal cattle ranch. It was a brutal, grueling cross-country hike over rough terrain. But if I could reach that trail, there was a chance a ranger or a local rancher might pass by. I didn't have my heavy pack or my hiking poles, but I had my utility jacket, my pocket knife, and half a liter of water. It was my only way out. I turned my back on the ridge overlook and plunged into the thick timber heading east, away from my campsite, away from the trail, and into the unbroken wilderness. The forest here was dense and treacherous. Ancient, fallen pine logs, covered in slick green moss, choked the ground, forcing me to climb over wet timber and navigate steep, shale-covered slopes. Twigs whipped against my face, tearing at my fleece jacket, but I didn't slow down. I ran, stumbled, and scrambled forward, driven by pure, unfiltered terror. Every 30 seconds, I glanced over my shoulder into the dark, silent aisles of pine trees behind me. Crack! A quarter-mile back, deep in the timber behind my left shoulder, a heavy dry branch snapped with the distinct sharp report of a heavy weight stepping on dead wood. My heart seized. I stopped dead in my tracks, pressing my back against the rough bark of a massive Douglas fir tree, holding my breath until my chest hurt. The forest fell deathly silent. No bird calls, no wind, just the dull, heavy pounding of my blood against my eardrums. I peered around the trunk of the tree. Through the dense sea of brown pine trunks, roughly 300 yards behind me, a dark shape moved smoothly between 2 thick thickets of fir trees. I wasn't running. He was pacing me, matching my trajectory through the woods, staying just far enough back to avoid a direct confrontation, but close enough to make sure I didn't slip away. He moved through the brush with practiced, terrifying ease, stepping lightly over fallen logs, his brown canvas jacket blending seamlessly with the dark forest floor. I wasn't trying to catch me yet. He was driving me deeper into the gulch, steering me away from the logging road, forcing me toward the treacherous shale cliffs where the terrain would trap me. I realized, with a sickening wave of horror, that every step I took was playing directly into his hands. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. I was a tourist following a map in my head. He was a predator herding an injured animal into a corner. My foot slipped on a patch of wet shale, and I went down hard, my knee slamming against a jagged rock. Pain shot up my leg, making tears spring to my eyes. I scrambled backward on my hands and butt as a shower of loose gravel clattered down the steep slope, bouncing into the dark gulch below. When the dust settled, I looked up, standing at the top of the rise. 70 yards above me, framed against the gray sky, was the tall man in the brown jacket and trucker hat. He looked down at me, scrambling in the dirt. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a metallic object, and held it up in his right hand. The sunlight caught the bright orange plastic casing. It was my satellite messenger. He held it out over the edge of the slope, opened his fingers, and let it drop. The orange beacon bounced uselessly down the rocky cliff face, crashing onto the granite boulders 50 feet below, shattering into a dozen pieces of useless plastic and wires. He lowered his hand, looked down at me, and spoke for the first time. His voice was surprisingly low, rasping, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You're going the wrong way, Clara," he said. My car wouldn't start the next morning. The mechanic later told me someone had deliberately disconnected a wire under the hood. The kind of thing you'd only know how to find if you'd done it before. When you spend days alone in the backcountry, you learn to trust the silence. You start to view the vast, empty pine forests not as a place of isolation, but as a sanctuary. You tell yourself that the cities are where danger lives, wrapped in crowd noise and streetlights, while the mountains are clean and honest. You believe that as long as you have a reliable vehicle, a full tank of gas, and enough water, you are in complete control of your own survival. My name is Clara. I'm 26 years old, a landscape photographer from Colorado. It was late September, right at the height of the aspen leaves turning golden across the Rocky Mountains. I had driven my 2018 silver Subaru Outback, deep into the Bridger-Teton National Forest in western Wyoming for a 4-day solo shooting assignment. I wasn't staying at an established campground with paved loops, camp hosts, or coin-operated showers. I was dispersed camping, setting up my pop-up roof tent on an unmanaged, primitive spur off Forest Road 3100. The campsite was gorgeous, but utterly remote. It sat on an elevated gravel turnaround, bordered by dense thickets of lodgepole pine, towering granite outcroppings, and a sweeping view of a river valley 600 feet below. To reach this spot, I had driven 5 miles down a washed-out, single-lane logging dirt road, crossing 2 narrow wooden cattle guards. There were no rangers here, no trash bins, no neighbors. The nearest paved highway was nearly 14 miles behind me, and my phone had dropped from 3 bars to no service the moment I crossed the National Forest boundary line yesterday morning. I arrived around 2 p.m. on Tuesday. The weather was crisp and clear, the mountain air smelling heavily of sap and dry pine needles. I parked my Subaru on the gravel pad, leveled the tires with wood blocks, and deployed my rooftop tent. I spent the late afternoon hiking down to a rocky ridge a half-mile away, lugging my tripod and camera bag to capture the golden hour light hitting the aspen groves across the valley. While I was setting up my shot on the ridge, I heard a faint, distant sound echoing through the timber below, a low, slow-moving engine rattle. I paused, looking down through my telephoto lens toward the dirt logging road. About a quarter mile through the trees, a beat-up, late 90s dark green Ford pickup truck was rolling slowly along Forest Road 3100. It wasn't kicking up a cloud of dust the way hunters or forestry workers usually drive. It was moving at a crawl, maybe 5 miles an hour, its rusted muffler giving off a rhythmic, hollow thrum. Through my camera lens, I saw the truck pause near the entrance of my spur road. The driver's side window was rolled down, but the interior was bathed in deep shadow under the thick pine canopy. I couldn't make out a face. Only the silhouette of a man wearing a dark-brimmed trucker hat, leaning his elbow on the door frame. He idled there for nearly 30 seconds, his eyes seemingly fixed on my parked Subaru and set up camp. Just someone looking for an open spot, I whispered to myself, lowering the camera. The truck didn't turn up my spur. After a moment, the engine revved slightly, and the green pickup continued down the dirt road until the sound faded completely into the expanse of the forest. I didn't think much of it. Dispersed camping areas are public land. People drive those logging roads all day looking for hunting spots or firewood. I finished my shoot, walked back to my campsite as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, and cooked a hot meal of rice and canned chili over my portable butane stove. By 9:00 p.m., the forest was plunged into pitch darkness. The temperature dropped sharply toward freezing. The night was dead calm. No wind, no rain. Just the endless, ink-black silence of the Wyoming wilderness under a carpet of sharp, cold stars. I climbed up the aluminum ladder into my rooftop tent, zipped the heavy canvas flaps tight against the chill, and settled into my thermal sleeping bag. I felt safe, warm, and entirely undisturbed. I woke up at 6:15 a.m. to the sharp, clear light of dawn filtering through the tent canvas. The air inside the tent was cold enough to turn my breath into thick white plumes. I unzipped the flap, climbed down the ladder, and started my morning routine. I packed up my sleeping gear, boiled water for coffee, and prepared to drive 10 miles south to shoot a secondary lake site I had marked on my paper topographical map. At 7:00 a.m., I sat in the driver's seat of my Subaru, turned the ignition key, and waited for the familiar, crisp roar of the 4-cylinder engine. Click, 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 click. The starter motor engaged instantly, spinning the engine over with a bright, healthy, metallic whir. Chug, 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 but the engine didn't catch. No sputter, no uneven gasps of combustion. Just the dry, endless, hollow spinning of a starter motor turning a dead engine. I paused, taken aback. I turned the key off, waited 5 seconds, and tried again. Chuk, 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 chuk. The battery was strong. The headlights beamed bright, the radio display lit up, and the fuel gauge sat comfortably at 3/4 of a tank, exactly where it was when I parked 16 hours ago. My car wasn't sputtering out of gas. It wasn't struggling with a drained battery. It was turning over perfectly. But something critical was preventing the fuel or spark from reaching the cylinders. I sat back against the headrest, my hands tightening on the leather steering wheel as a sudden, cold prickle of unease settled at the base of my neck. I sat in the cold driver's seat for 3 full minutes, staring at the digital clock on the dashboard as the seconds ticked past. Another 4 a.m. Think logically, Clara, I muttered to myself, forcing my lungs to expand. It's a 5-year-old car. Relays fail. Sensors freeze in the mountain cold. It's a mechanical glitch. I popped the hood latch from inside the cab, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and walked around to the front of the vehicle. The hood gave a metallic clack as I lifted it, locking the metal prop rod into place. I'm not a professional mechanic, but I've taken my Subaru on enough backcountry solo trips to know the basic layout under the hood. I checked the battery terminals. They were clean, tight, and free of corrosion. I opened the fuse box besides the air filter. Every fuse was intact, their thin metal filaments solid and unbroken. Then I leaned deeper over the hot radiator shroud, shining my phone's flashlight beam into the cramped space between the engine block and the firewall. My breath caught in my throat. Right near the back of the air intake assembly sat the main wiring harness for the crankshaft position sensor, a critical electrical connection that tells the car's computer when to fire the spark plugs. The plastic locking tab on the wire coupler was freshly unclipped. The 2 black plastic connectors hadn't vibrated loose. They had been pulled apart by a fraction of an inch and tucked neatly behind a metal bracket, so it looked connected from a distance. Worse still, looking closely at the tiny copper pins inside the female plug. One of the delicate grounding leads had been cleanly bent sideways with a pair of needle-nose pliers, preventing any electrical current from bridging the connection, even if the plug was pushed back together. This wasn't wear and tear. This wasn't mountain cold. Someone who understood Subaru engine bays had stood over my open hood while I was away from camp, reached into the cramped engine compartment, unlatched a hidden sensor, bent the pin, and quietly closed the hood. My knees felt suddenly weak, as if the ground beneath my boots had turned to soft sand. I whirled around, my eyes sweeping the perimeter of my campsite. The tall lodgepole pines stood silent and motionless under the early morning sun. The gravel turnaround looked completely untouched. My rooftop tent was still folded. My stove sat on the wooden camp table where I had left it. I walked slowly toward the driver's side front tire, dropping to one knee to examine the soft, damp mud where the gravel ended. Beside the deep, aggressive tread of my own hiking boots was a second set of footprint impressions. They were large, wide, and fresh. The heavy waffle-patterned lug sole prints of a size 11 or 12 work boot. The edges of the tread lines in the mud were sharp and crisp, completely unwashed by the light evening dew. The tracks didn't approach from the logging road. They came from the thick, overgrown pine forest directly behind my campsite. Stepping out from the trees, standing right beside my driver's side front tire where the hood latch release sat inside the cab, and then walking back into the dark timber. I had been standing right outside my tent while I was asleep. I scrambled back to my feet, my chest heaving as pure, cold adrenaline flooded my veins. Okay, I whispered, my voice trembling violently. Get the emergency locator beacon. Call for help. I reached into my pocket for my satellite messenger, a small, orange GPS device I always kept clipped to my photography backpack. My pocket was empty. Panic seized me, like a physical hand gripping my throat. I threw open the passenger door of the Subaru, digging through my photography tote, dumping out camera lenses, battery packs, and memory card cases onto the seat. The orange satellite messenger was gone. The heavy leather camera bag sitting on my back seat had been unzipped. My expensive camera lenses were still there, thousands of dollars in glass untouched. But the small $100 GPS SOS beacon that could send a satellite distress signal to emergency services had been systematically plucked from the side pocket. I didn't want my gear. He didn't want my car. I wanted me completely cut off from the outside world. I grabbed my regular smartphone off the dashboard. The screen still displayed the same soul-crushing message in the top corner: no service. I knew from my topographical map that the summit of the ridge overlook, the rocky outcrop half a mile away, where I had shot the sunset yesterday, sat 800 feet higher than this gravel hollow. On mountain terrain, higher sometimes offered a sliver of line-of-sight cell reception from a distant highway tower. I had two choices: stay at the disabled car in an isolated hollow with no way to call for help, or hike up to the exposed rocky ridge to try and get a single emergency call through. I grabbed my water bottle, my heavy pocket knife, and my phone, shoving them into my fleece jacket pockets. I locked the Subaru's doors, a useless gesture, but an instinctual one, and began walking rapidly up the narrow dirt footpath leading toward the ridge overlook. The trail wound steeply upward through a dense stand of young fir trees. Every rustle of dry leaves in the wind made my head snap to the left and right. Every creak of a swaying pine branch sounded like a footstep trailing behind me. 15 minutes later, dripping with sweat despite the freezing air, I broke through the tree line onto the exposed granite boulders of the ridge overlook. I pulled out my phone, holding it high above my head, pacing back and forth across the flat rock face. The gray signal bars flickered. 1 bar. Searching. 1 bar. 3G. Yes! Come on! I sobbed, dialing 911 and pressing the phone tight against my ear. The line didn't ring. It gave a hollow, double-beep static buzz, the sound of a call failing to connect through a weak signal. I stepped closer to the edge of the granite cliff, raising the phone higher, searching for the exact angle to lock onto the distant tower. As I raised my eyes to look across the vast, green sea of pine trees, stretching out thousands of feet below, my gaze drifted down toward the gravel turnaround of my campsite, half a mile down the valley. From this high-ridge vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed line of sight, straight down into my campsite. Standing right beside my silver Subaru, bathed in the bright morning sunlight, was a tall man wearing a dark brown canvas jacket and a faded trucker hat. I was standing completely motionless beside my driver's side door, holding a pair of heavy black binoculars pressed to his eyes, and he was pointing the binoculars directly up the mountain, staring straight at me. The words hung in the warm, stagnant sea air, heavy and suffocating. He knew about the green flash. He knew I stayed until the sun dipped entirely below the liquid horizon. He had read my captions from 3 days ago, 5 days ago, 2 weeks ago. My mind scrambled to find a normal, non-threatening explanation. Maybe he's just a local photographer who follows my page? Maybe he's just an awkward guy trying to make conversation? But my gut, the primitive, unreasoning part of my brain that knew I was sitting in a piece of hollow plastic surrounded by miles of open ocean, refused to accept it. I have a dinner reservation with my group back at the marina at 6, I lied smoothly, pulling the anchor line up and coiling it quickly into the front storage hatch. Need to beat the dark. The man didn't answer. He reached down and pulled his dark sunglasses off, letting them hang from a strap around his neck. His eyes were small, pale blue, and entirely unblinking. Group? He asked, a thin, crooked smile touching the corner of his lips. That's funny. Your caption from 20 minutes ago said, just me, the water, and total peace. You don't have a group out here, Maya. He said my name, hearing my real name, spoken by a complete stranger. 2 miles off the coast sent a shockwave of adrenaline straight to my limbs. I didn't say another word. I dipped my paddle blades into the water, executed a sharp sweep stroke, and turned the kayak's bow toward the north, heading straight for the shoreline, 2 miles away. I paddled with long, powerful strokes, my core muscles flexing rhythmically. In a kayak, a skilled paddler can maintain a speed of 4 or 5 knots for a decent stretch. But against a motorized skiff, it was a joke. I had covered maybe 50 yards when the engine behind me roared to life. Rome! The high-pitched whine of his outboard motor shattered the quiet glass of the water. I looked over my shoulder. The gray skiff wasn't passing me. It was steering in a wide arc, accelerating fast, cutting directly across my path. Hey! I shouted, digging my paddle into brace. What are you doing? The skiff shot past my bow at 20 knots, less than 15 feet away. The displacement of his hull pushed up a steep, churning wake wave. A wall of white water 3 feet high, rolling straight toward my broadside. Watch the wake! I screamed, leaning my weight hard into the oncoming wave, planting my paddle blade flat against the water to support my balance. The wave hit my kayak with violent force. The plastic hull tipped sharply to the left, water pouring over the gunnels, soaking my lap and filling the floor well. My DSLR camera inside its dry bag slammed against my knees. For 2 terrifying seconds, gravity failed, and I was on the absolute brink of flipping upside down into the deep channel. I gasped, slapping my right paddle blade down hard, bracing with everything I had. The kayaks slammed back down flat onto the surface with a loud slap, rocking violently in the foamy chop. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it was going to burst through my rash guard. 50 yards ahead, the skiff slowed down, spun around in a spray of white water, and shifted back into neutral. He had placed his boat directly between me and the shoreline. He had cut off my straight path back to the boat ramp. "Sorry about that," he called out through his hand, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Choppy out here today. You almost went under there, Maya. You need a ride back." It was a calculation. A dangerous, predatory game of intimidation. He was using his wake to stability, threaten my tiny boat, trying to force a situation where I would capsize and have no choice but to climb onto his bare fiberglass deck. "Stay away from me," I yelled, my voice cracking slightly despite my best efforts to sound tough. "I am turning on my location tracker right now. The Coast Guard tracks this kayak." I snatched the clear waterproof pouch hanging from my neck. My fingers fumbled furiously with the plastic Ziploc seal, pulling out my smartphone. I hit the screen button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, holding it down with my thumb, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. A red battery icon flashed briefly on the black screen, a tiny hollow line of red. And then the phone went completely dead. The salt heat, combined with running my camera app, live streaming, and GPS location tagging for 3 hours straight in the blazing Florida sun, had drained the lithium battery completely. The screen stayed black. No signal, no map, no emergency call. No one coming to look for me until I failed to return my gear to the conservation center at 8 p.m., over 2 hours away. I looked up from the dead screen, out on the horizon. The bottom rim of the setting sun was touching the ocean, turning the sky into a bruised shade of purple and deep red. Shadows were stretching long across the water, and 50 yards away, the gray skiff putted slowly toward me, its engine idling in a low, hungry growl. The dead phone screen reflected my own wide, terrified eyes back at me before fading to total black. 2 miles from shore, sun dipping below the horizon, a dead phone, and a man on a motorized boat cutting off my direct route to safety. The open expanse of water that had felt so liberating 2 hours ago now felt like a vast, watery prison. There were no trees to hide behind, no alleys to dodge into, no doors to lock. Just thousands of acres of flat, exposed salt water where my bright red kayak stood out like a flares-lit target. I thrust the dead phone back into my dry pouch and grabbed my paddle, my mind racing through my limited knowledge of the local waterways. To my left, 2 miles north, lay the main public marina and boat ramp where my truck was parked, currently blocked by his skiff. To my right, a mile south, lay the vast open ocean leading out toward the deep reef. Behind me, half a mile to the east, across a shallow grass flat, was a tiny, dense mangrove island known as Shingle Key. Shingle Key was an uninhabited bird sanctuary. It was surrounded by an impenetrable tangle of submerged red mangrove roots and shallow mud banks. A full-sized skiff with an outboard motor couldn't get within 50 yards of its center without destroying its propeller on the roots. But a shallow draft kayak? I could glide right into the flooded interior channels. It was my only chance to buy time until full dark, when I could use the cover of night to slip past him toward shore. I didn't give him a chance to read my movement. I dug my left blade deep into the water, pulled hard, and spun my kayak 180 degrees, paddling at a breakneck sprint straight toward the tangled green wall of Shingle Key. "Hey!" His voice boomed across the water, sharp and commanding now. "Where are you going? The ramp is the other way." I ignored him, burying my head and focusing every ounce of strength into my shoulders and core. Reach, pull, rotate. Reach, pull, rotate. The plastic hull surged forward, cutting through the calm water, leaving a foaming trail of white wake behind me. Behind me, the skiff's engine roared to life with a terrifying mechanical scream. "Vroom!" He threw the throttle forward, the skiff rising up on plane, the high-pitched whine of the engine closing the distance between us with horrifying speed. He wasn't just idling now, he was pursuing me at full speed. I kept my eyes fixed on the green wall of mangroves ahead. 500 yards, 400 yards. The sound of his engine became a deafening roar right behind my head. The smell of burning oil hit my nose. I could feel the physical vibration of his hull cutting through the water 50 feet behind me. "Stop paddling, Maya!" he screamed over the engine roar. "Pull over right now!" I didn't stop. I dug my paddle blades deeper, my arms burning, my lungs screaming for air. 200 yards. Suddenly, the water beneath my kayak changed color, shifting instantly from deep navy blue to a pale, milky turquoise. I was crossing the ridge of the shallow sand, flat surrounding the mangrove island. The water depth plunged from 10 feet down to less than 18 inches in a matter of yards. Screech grind. A sickening metallic crunch echoed across the water as the lower unit of his skiff's outboard motor slammed violently into the submerged sandbar and mangrove roots at 20 knots. The engine bucked wildly, spraying a massive rooster tail of sand, mud, and water 30 feet into the air. The skiff ground to an abrupt, violent halt, its bow pitching downward as the propeller chewed uselessly into the thick mud flat. "Damn it!" I heard him roar, cursing loudly as his engine stalled and sputtered out into silence. The sudden loss of his engine noise left only the sound of my ragged, desperate panting and the splash of my paddle. I didn't celebrate. I paddled over the shallow flat, my kayak gliding effortlessly over 6 inches of water, where his boat was now hopelessly grounded. I reached the edge of Shingle Key, jammed my paddle against the mud, and forced the front of my kayak straight into a narrow, tunnel-like gap between the sprawling red mangrove roots. The thick, waxy green leaves closed over my head, blotting out the twilight sky, swallowing me in a humid, shadow-drenched canopy. I pulled my kayak deep into the roots until the plastic hull was wedged tight between two thick trunks, totally hidden from the open water. I crouched low in my seat, pressing my forehead against my knees, trying to smother the loud, raspy sound of my breathing. Out on the mud flat, 50 yards away, through the dense tangle of roots, an eerie, absolute silence settled over the water. The sun had officially set. The sky outside the mangroves was turning a bruised, dark indigo. Then, cut through the quiet, came the wet, heavy sound of a splash. Someone stepping out of a boat. Squelch, squelch, squelch. Heavy rubber boots, sinking into 2 feet of thick, soft mangrove mud. "I know you're in the roots, Maya." His raspy voice drifted through the dark branches, uncomfortably close. My boat might be stuck on the mud bar, but I'm not. It's low tide. The water out here is only waist deep. I wasn't waiting for the tide to rise to free his boat. He was wading through the mud flat on foot, carrying whatever he had brought with him, coming straight into the darkness of the mangroves to find me. The squelching sound of heavy rubber boots trudging through the soft, knee-deep mud was coming closer. Squelch, drag, squelch, drag. Inside the dark labyrinth of the mangrove roots, the air was thick, stagnant, and humid, smelling of rotting sea vegetation and sulfur. The last glow of twilight had died outside, plunging the interior of Islamorada Click to open side panel for more information's coastal flats into near-pitch blackness. I sat huddled low in my molded seat, holding my breath, my knees pressed tightly against my chest. In my hands, I held my heavy aluminum-shafted paddle. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had. "You really made this a lot harder than it needed to be, Maya." Wade's voice rasped from just beyond the outer fringe of leaves, 20 yards away. A sharp beam of light cut through the dark branches. He had turned on an intense white headlamp. The LED beam danced across the tangled aerial roots, illuminating the dark water beneath my hull in flashes of blinding light. "I've been watching your account since May," he continued, his tone eerily conversational over the heavy sound of his breathing. "Every time you tagged your location, I logged it. You're so predictable. Every Tuesday and Thursday, out on the water alone. You made it so easy." My heart pounded frantically against my ribs. He hadn't just chanced upon my stream. He had built a database of my movements over months. The light swept closer, hitting the bright red plastic stern of my kayak. "Found you," he whispered. The branches rustled violently as he shoved his way into the root tunnel, his large frame forcing through the thick wooden lattice. He reached out with a gloved hand, grabbing the rear handle of my kayak and pulling it backward out of the root wedge. "Get out of the boat," he ordered, his face illuminated from below by his headlamp. In his left hand, he held a thick coiled length of yellow polypropylene marine rope. I didn't argue. I didn't freeze. As he pulled the kayak closer to drag me into the mud, I raised my double-bladed paddle with both hands and thrust the heavy plastic blade straight forward into his face with every ounce of power left in my arms. Slam! The sharp edge of the blade caught him flush across his nose and mouth. Wade let out a muffled grunt of shock and pain, stumbling backward off balance into the deep mud. His headlamp tilted upward, blinding him against the dark foliage as he clutched his bleeding face. I didn't wait. I threw myself over the side of the kayak, plunging waist deep into the cold, muddy water. The mud tried to pull my sneakers down like quicksand, but the sudden adrenaline surge gave me explosive strength. I dragged my legs through the heavy muck, scrambling toward the open water side of the mangrove island where his grounded skiff lay stranded on the sandbar. "Get back here!" Wade roared behind me, thrashing violently through the roots as he recovered. I burst out of the mangrove line onto the shallow sand flat. The cool sea air hit my face, and 50 yards away, I saw the silhouette of his matte gray center console skiff sitting tilted on the sandbar. And beyond his boat, out in the deeper channel half a mile away, 3 bright green and red navigation lights were moving slowly across the dark water, a fleet of night commercial shrimping boats returning to port. "Help! Over here! Help me!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, waving my arms frantically in the air as I dragged myself across the shallow water toward his boat. I reached the grounded skiff, grabbed the aluminum gunwale, and hauled myself over the side onto the fiberglass deck. On the console sat his marine radio microphone and a red emergency distress flare tucked in a plastic side rack. I snatched the plastic flare, pulled the safety cap, and struck the friction igniter against the top. A brilliant, blinding shower of crimson fire exploded into the night sky, illuminating the entire mud flat in a harsh blood-red glare. Dark red smoke billowed into the air. I held the spitting flare high above my head, screaming continuously toward the distant commercial boats. "Mayday! Mayday! Help me!" Across the mud flat, Wade broke out of the mangrove trees, his face covered in blood, staring in utter disbelief at the blinding crimson flare illuminating his face, his boat, and his entire position for miles around. In the channel, the engine pitch of the lead shrimper shifted instantly. A powerful 50,000 candle power searchlight swept across the water from the big boat's deck, locking its brilliant white beam directly onto Wade's stranded skiff and illuminating him in the middle of the shallow flat. The shrimper's horn blasted 3 long, deafening blasts across the water, acknowledging the flare signal and alerting the Coast Guard station nearby. Wade looked at the massive searchlight pinning him in place, looked at me holding the flare, and realized the game was over. He turned, dropped his rope into the mud, and began desperately crawling backward into the dark mangrove interior, trying to hide from the blinding light above. The boat that pulled up next to mine didn't have a single fishing rod on board. The man driving it asked if I was anchored alone out here often. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists 2 miles off the coast of the Florida Keys. When the afternoon wind dies down, the Atlantic Ocean flattens into a sheet of polished blue glass, stretching out until it meets the hazy pink horizon. Out there, surrounded by miles of open water, you feel completely free. You feel weightless. You also forget how totally, utterly alone you really are. My name is Maya. I'm a 20-year-old marine biology student, and during the summer before my junior year, I took a job assisting at a local mangrove conservation center near Isla Morada. To build my portfolio for undergraduate research grants, I spent almost every late afternoon out on the water with my camera. My vehicle of choice was a slim, 12-foot sea kayak. It was bright red, lightweight, and allowed me to glide silently through shallow flats where motorboats couldn't go. I loved capturing images of blue herons, nurse sharks resting in the seagrass, and the dramatic fire-orange sunsets that swept over the Keys. To document my progress, and frankly, to show off a little to my friends back home, I maintained a public photography account on social media. Every time I hit the water, I posted a live story. Heading out to Blackwood Shoal. Perfect glass water today. I tagged the exact GPS location every single time. It felt harmless. It felt like sharing beauty with the world. It was a Tuesday afternoon, around 5:30 p.m. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the west, casting long, golden ribbons across the water. I had paddled about 2 miles out from the public boat ramp, anchoring my kayak near a rusted, sun-bleached steel navigation buoy that marked the edge of a deep water channel. The water around the buoy was only about 4 feet deep, crystal clear grass flats where rays like to feed. I had my heavy DSLR camera wrapped in a waterproof dry bag resting between my knees. My phone sat in a clear, sealed plastic lanyard pouch hanging around my neck. The air was completely still. The only sound was the rhythmic, gentle lap of water against the plastic hull of my kayak. Then, a faint, low vibration rattled through the floorboards of my kayak. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It wasn't the sound of an outboard engine running at high speed. It was the heavy, wet idling of a marine diesel engine held in low gear. I turned around in my molded plastic seat, shielding my eyes against the glare of the setting sun. A sleek, 18-foot center console fiberglass skiff was drifting out of the deep channel, moving slowly across the shallow flats. The boat was painted a dull, matte gray, devoid of any registration decals or charter logos. What caught my attention instantly, the detail that made my stomach do a strange, subtle flip, was the deck. In the Florida Keys, every skiff out on the flats at 5:30 p.m. is equipped for fishing. They have rod holders lining the console, gaffs tucked into the gunnels, tackle boxes, or at least a cooler. This boat was completely bare. Clean deck. No rods, no cooler, no sunshade canopy. Standing behind the center steering console was a man in his mid-30s. He wore dark sunglasses, a grease-stained faded blue t-shirt, and a dark baseball cap pulled down low. He wasn't looking at the horizon. He wasn't scanning the water for fish. His face was turned directly toward me. I didn't speed up. He just let the skiff drift forward until the bow of his boat was less than 20 feet from the side of my kayak. The smell of unburnt boat fuel and warm engine oil drifted over the clean sea air. "Nice afternoon for it," he called out. His voice was flat, carrying easily across the calm water. "Yeah, sure is," I replied, keeping my tone polite but clipped. I picked up my double-bladed paddle and laid it across my lap, an involuntary defensive reflex. "You're out here pretty far for a plastic kayak," he said, shifting the engine into neutral. The propeller sputtered, keeping the boat hovering in place. "I saw your post an hour ago. You said you were shooting at the rusted buoy." My fingers tightened around the aluminum shaft of my paddle until my knuckles turned white. "I saw your post." I hadn't spoken to this man. I had never seen his boat at the public marina. Yet he knew I was at the rusted buoy because he had been watching my story feed. "I'm just wrapping up," I said, forcing a calm smile as I unhooked my small folding anchor line from the kayak's cleat. Sun's dropping fast, heading back to the ramp. The man didn't move to clear a path. He rested his hands on the stainless steel steering wheel of his boat, leaning forward slightly. "Why rush?" he asked softly. "You said on your page you always stay until the green flash at sunset. You've got at least 20 minutes left." A cold, sharp shiver traced its way down my spine, completely ignoring the 80-degree Florida heat. He hadn't just looked at today's story. He had memorized my routine. The commercial shrimping boat, the Sea Rover, couldn't cross the shallow sandbar to reach me directly. But they remained anchored in the deep channel, bathing the entire mud flat in their massive commercial searchlights while broadcasting a priority mayday to the United States Coast Guard. Within 20 minutes, the high-pitched twin engines of a 29-foot Coast Guard response boat echoed across the water. Their shallow draft vessel navigated the shoal, throwing bright blue spotlights into the mangroves as 4 armed officers stepped out into the waist-deep water. They secured me first, wrapping a warm shock blanket around my soaked shoulders and lifting me onto their deck, while a paramedic checked my blood pressure and wiped the mud from my scraped knees. 3 officers waded deep into the tangled roots of Shingle Key with handheld thermal imaging units. Wade Vance didn't make it far. He was found huddled inside a dense pocket of red mangrove roots, 30 yards from his grounded boat, covered in black muck and his own blood, clutching a dead flashlight. I was handcuffed, pulled out of the swamp, and marched onto the Coast Guard deck. As they walked him past me, he kept his head down, refusing to make eye contact. The intimidating, calm predator who had used his wake waves to rock my kayak had vanished, replaced by a pathetic, disheveled man staring silently at his own boots. The legal process was swift and uncompromising. Wade was charged with felony stalking, reckless endangerment, aggravated assault on open water, and attempted kidnapping. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission impounded his matte gray skiff as evidence. When detectives searched his boat at the station, they made a discovery that elevated his case to a federal investigation. Inside the center console, hidden behind a locked maintenance panel, police recovered a waterproof dry box containing 4 smartphones, 3 cameras, and a thick accordion folder containing hundreds of printed location screenshots. I wasn't just tracking me. He was part of an underground online forum dedicated to scraping real-time geotags and social media stories from solo female outdoor enthusiasts, kayakers, hikers, campers, and trail runners across the Florida coastline. The group members traded live location pins, mapped out isolated spots where their targets traveled alone, and logged the precise times when these women were furthest from help. I wasn't his first target. I was simply the first one who managed to fight back and set off a flare. I moved back to my parents' home in Orlando 3 weeks after the incident. I sold my Red Sea kayak, deleted every single social media account I owned, and changed my phone number. I transferred my college credits to an online degree program, so I would never have to sit in a physical lecture hall where strangers could see my face or look up my schedule. I did everything a person could reasonably do to erase their digital footprint from the world. It has been nearly 2 years since that sun set out on Blackwood Shoal. Wade Vance is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a Florida state prison, his appeals repeatedly denied. On paper, the nightmare ended the night the Coast Guard pulled me off that sandbar. Yet, true safety is an illusion that, once shattered, can never be pieced back together. I don't go near the water anymore. I don't take photos of the sky, and I turn off location services on every electronic device that enters my home. I live a quiet, completely invisible life, or at least I thought I did. Last Tuesday, while clearing out the physical junk mail folder in the mailbox outside my house, I found a plain white envelope with no return address. The postmark was local, mailed from right here in Orlando. Inside was a single piece of glossy photographic paper. It was a picture of me taken from distance. A shot of me sitting on my back porch last weekend, holding a mug of tea, completely unaware that anyone was watching. I turned the photograph over with trembling hands. On the back, written in neat, printed black ink, was a short message that makes my heart stop every single time I think about it. Wade wasn't the admin of the forum, Maya. He was just a subscriber. Thanks for keeping your account active.